I call for the chairman?
I don't think it'd be a good idea.
I can't call for the chairman.
It's probably on TV. Rules come to order, and thank you very much for joining us. Another beautiful evening at the Rules Committee. The text here says good afternoon. I'll amend that. It is good evening. It is now 10:15 p.m. Eastern Time. This evening, the Rules Committee will be considering the Senate Amendment to H.R. 1625, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2018. This 12-bill appropriations package provides funding for fiscal year 2018 at levels consistent with the Bipartisan Budget Agreement Act and the National Defense Authorization Act. After years of neglect, this legislation begins to rebuild our military by providing $659.6 billion to fund our national defense. The bill strengthens missile defense, funds new weapon systems, invests heavily in measures designed to counter threats around the world, including North Korea. Funds national security priorities, including nuclear modernization, nuclear submarines, other instruments of peace, and other important shipbuilding and aircraft procurement needs of our United States military to support the men and women of the United States military and to protect this country. This legislation also includes a long overdue 2.4% pay raise for our troops and money for our veterans by providing a record level of funding for the Veterans Administration while increasing oversight and modernization. It provides robust funding to fight terrorism, enhance new criminal law enforcement, and help secure our United States borders. It increases funding for border security and other law enforcement and immigration laws of the United States of America. Legislation also includes new infrastructure funding for highways, waterways, airways, railways, and other infrastructure priorities to ensure public safety and for us to address and promote economic development for the United States of America, to make America great again. Provides $4 billion to combat the opioid crisis, increases NIH funding by $3 billion, and provides over $2.3 billion in new funding for mental health, training, and school safety efforts that will help keep our children and our schools safe. This legislation provides certainty and predictability to the men and women in uniform and ensures that for the first time in years, our United States military personnel will have the resources and the budget certainty by increasing it to help them to do their job. We want to be reminded that more members of the United States military were killed in training than combat last year. This is something that distressed not only myself, but the appropriators and the young chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Mac Thornberry, and I want to thank Mr. Frelinghuysen for making sure this level of funding was achieved. So without objection, I'd like to welcome the distinguished young gentleman from New Jersey, Chairman Frelinghuysen, and my dear friend from New York, the ranking member, Mrs. Lowy, to our first panel. Anything you have in writing will help our awesome stenographer complete her record, not only of the transcript of what was said in here, but also allow her as she engages in trying to put it all together for it to make sense for the record. I want to thank both of you for being here. Before I move any further, I want to recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts for any opening statement the gentleman chooses to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee for being here, for their service. I know you guys have been up for quite some time and are here with very little sleep. I want to thank your staffs for all the work that they have done on this. I know it hasn't been easy, and I appreciate that. But having said that, you know, I'm going to tell you in advance, I'm probably not going to have very many questions because I don't know what to ask. I know that there are some things here that I will like and some things I don't like. What I'm worried about is the stuff I don't know. This is 2,200 pages that we just received. Even if I went to the Evelyn Wood Speed Reading School, I couldn't get through this in time for the vote. And I point out, and this is not your fault, because you have no control over this, but this process leaves a lot to be desired. And for the life of me, I don't know why we go from one crisis to another crisis to another crisis. I mean, the urgency now is that if we don't do something quickly, we're going to shut the government down again. And there's got to be a better way to do this, and one in which people actually know what they're voting on and are not just given summaries. So again, I appreciate all of your work. I'm not here to criticize you or your staffs. I'm in awe of your work ethic and your dedication, but it is this process that I think is really quite awful. And you know, I don't know how I'm going to end up voting on this when it comes to the floor tomorrow, but I would certainly feel a lot better had we had time to be able to review this more thoroughly, and had I had confidence that I could actually tell my constituents that there are no surprises here. And anyway, I don't want to belabor this point, but again, I am grateful to you, and I will yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McGovern, thank you very much. Let me say this. I think your words were right on and well spoken, and I want to thank you not only for the way which you said them, but we need to take that as advice. We did not take that as criticism. We took it as, if it's going to be done correctly, we need to do a better job, and I appreciate the gentleman and his tone and tenor. We also do want to recognize the gentleman from the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Cole, who represents this committee, the gentleman from the state of Washington, who represents the Appropriations Committee, and we want to thank them for their service, knowing that they have been a part of the process to get us here in this final resolution. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you very much. Mr. Newhouse, thank you for your service. Mr. Chairman, these two members of the committee serve with honor and distinction up here. They do extra duty. I don't know if they'll get extra pay. That's up to you. But I want you to know.
They don't, Mr. Chairman. But they do. They've done a wonderful job for the people of the United States.
Well, they're here for both you and Mrs. Lowy, and we appreciate their service and their time, and you allowing them to double dip up here as they double do their duty. We appreciate the gentleman be here. The gentleman's now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and may I say many happy returns of the day tomorrow. I understand the big days for you.
You know, everybody turns 55 once in their life.
Well, thank you.
And I won't be 55.
Thank you for the warm reception. Also, Mr. McGovern and all members for all the continuous courtesies you provide all of us when we come here.
Thank you, sir.
Before I begin, I'd just like to take a moment to remember Mrs. Slaughter and extend my condolences to her family, to all those who knew and loved her, including all of you. She always treated our committee, as do all the members here, with a great degree of respect, and we will always remember her for her steadfastness and her frankness and true spirit. Thank you for having me and Ms. Lowy here before the committee tonight to present the House amendment to the Senate amendment, H.R. 1625, the final appropriations package for fiscal year 2018. I'm here before the committee this evening to seek an appropriate rule to provide for the prompt consideration of this long-awaited measure. Our current continuing resolution expires this Friday, March 23rd, and it's time we enact a full-year funding legislation into law, complete our work for the fiscal year 2018, and return our attention to 2019. This legislation represents thousands of hours of hard work and consideration, bipartisan, I may add, beginning in the Appropriations Committee back in June and continuing through this past weekend with good faith negotiations between the committee, the House and Senate leadership on both sides of the aisle. It addresses thousands of member priorities, those submitted through our member database, amendments offered on the House floor in an open and inclusive process, and shared with us throughout negotiations. It reflects our common values. It will help move our nation forward, and I ask for your favorable consideration of our bill. And yield back.
Mr. Frelinghuysen, thank you very much. Ms. Lowy, what a pleasure it is to see you again this evening. I saw you early this morning, and you guessed we'd be with each other tonight, and you were right.
And how fortunate I am to be here so I can wish you an early happy birthday.
Thank you
very
much.
Best wishes to
Thank you
you.
very much. These birthdays just keep coming, Nita.
Let's hope they keep coming. Right? Well, let me say, my colleagues, while I'm pleased to testify here today, I am deeply saddened that my friend Louise Slaughter is not here with us. As we all know, Louise's passion, effectiveness have left a mark on this institution, and she leaves a legacy that has improved life for New Yorkers and all Americans in countless ways. We all will remember her. The Omnibus Appropriation Act before us invests robustly in critical priorities like child care, transportation, infrastructure, national security, election protection, medical research, opioid abuse, prevention and treatment, veterans' health services, and so much more. These investments are key to strong families and communities, job creation, and economic growth. I'm also very pleased that the omnibus rejects scores of divisive poison pill riders targeting women's health, clean air and water, worker rights, consumer financial protections, health insurance, and other very important priorities. In addition, I'm pleased the omnibus includes language clarifying that the CDC has the authority to conduct research on the causes of gun violence, an issue I've been working on for many years. To be clear, this is not a perfect product. I strongly object to the majority's fixation on walling off our southern border and building capacity to arrest and detain immigrants. While the bill rejects the administration's demand for tens of billions for a border wall, the president's beefed up deportation force and more immigration and customs enforcement detention beds, the amount provided nonetheless a waste of money and contrary to our national character. I want to thank you for the opportunity to address this committee, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to discussing this spending package with each of you. If you're all awake this evening, we're happy to answer some questions. Thank you.
Ms. Lowy, thank you very much. The committee has gone through much, and Mr. Chairman, the committee has gone through much of the work previously as you have come up. Could you lead us through some bit of discussion about any changes, if any, that may have occurred that had been in the earlier bills that might not be in there now?
Well,
And that may not be a fair question. I noticed a little bit of a smile.
Let me respond. We did our 12 appropriations bills back in September of last year. So the product we have tonight is a result of what's called the CAPS deal, which I think you're familiar with, Mr. Chairman and members, which added a large amount, well-needed amount for defense, and also addressed a number of national domestic priorities. And it was the responsibility of Chairman Cole and the other 11 chairmen to figure out how to spend that money as wisely and as prudently as possible. And I know that the members are both parties on the Appropriations Committee work very closely together to sort of prioritize all of that spending without creating new programs. I think they did a pretty good job. They also respected, I think, the member priorities that were in there initially, which were many thousand member priorities that reflected either the member's congressional district, their region, or their state, and many of those continue to be incorporated in the final package. Like with every bill, through the process of negotiations, there are riders that are attached to bills, and historically, some of those tend to be dropped, but that's done after consultation with both all of our leaderships and all of our committee chairs. So I think all in all, it's a process we built upon. It was the Senate that was actually lacking in action. The House has been ready to sort of push its product forward, has been for some months now. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Ms. Lowy, I have been approached by several of your ranking members, including some discussions with Mr. Serrano and others, who felt like they were dealt with fairly.
I'd like to certainly agree with my chair, but respond to your comments from Mr. Serrano. We have one of our most distinguished chairs here this evening, who's head of Labor, Health, Human Services, Education. And I've been here for a while, but this was one of the best processes that I can recall. And the chairman and the ranking member really worked in partnership. I think each of the bills reflects this good work. I want to thank you in particular for your focus on the National Institutes of Health, Child Care, Education, and so much more. And the bipartisan effort in putting together this material really has led to, in my judgment, excellent bills. We can be proud of the work of all 12 bills. So I want to thank the chairman while you're here, and I thank you. I think we work together in a constructive way, and we have products we can be proud of.
Yes, ma'am. Well, I think the reason why I'm trying to highlight this is each of us are always subject to questions about our ability to work with each other and to work, me with my team too, Tom with his team. I will tell you, as you suggested, the gentleman, Tom Cole, as subcommittee chairman, held a number of hearings, not only on Down syndrome, intellectual disability, intellectual cognitive issues, but tonight I had the honor of emceeing Francis Collins, who is the head of the NIH, for the 50th anniversary of the National Eye Institute. Dr. Paul Seaving is our NEI, our director for the National Eye Institute. And there was a direct conversation about how important our conversation of pushing them is, an equal push and pull that goes back to all of us working together. And I think when we all work together and see these opportunities for America, it works really well, and I wanted to bring that up. And Mr. Chairman, I know you are very sensitive to the needs of what members when they come to you. Your team did a heck of a job, and I believe that, in fact, the working together was part of that, so I appreciate that a lot. I need to note that I have talked to my staff. I do not see the bill in front of me. That means that our Xerox machine is slower than we were timing-wise. So I'm at a severe disadvantage also, and that's why I've chosen to ask the questions without the confidence that I have of knowing the answer or interrogating you perhaps a little bit more about the processes. So please consider this. I'll do my due diligence later, but I want to thank both of you. Chairman Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by saying it's always a delight to see my chairman, my ranking member here. Just for the committee's edification, these two people produced an omnibus last year. They produced 3 supplementals to deal with hurricane disaster release. They produced another omnibus today. and they are in the midst of writing a bill for next year. And I tell you, I think it would be hard for any chairman and ranking member of any committee to match that level of productivity. And it tells you a lot, and the chairman was kind enough to mention this about the staff that both of you have, and what a phenomenal job they've done for our committee and for this Congress, and I think for this country. Obviously know the bill pretty well because I've gotten to be part of it. And I want to, again, agree with what both chairmen said. This is bill, actually, while an omnibus is never regular order, and while all of us would prefer 12 separate bills, the process was regular order. Each one of these bills was written individually. Each one was reported out of subcommittee. Each one was fully debated in full committee, subject to amendment across the board, left and right. Each one was passed out of that committee, and then they were grouped together and passed across the floor. And you've done what you're saying. You've waited patiently for the Senate never managed to get a single bill across, let alone all of them across. And you waited over 80 days or something, something like that, to negotiate with our friends on the other side of the rotunda. And you have, and obviously leadership and the administration become part of that negotiation. And you've gotten it here, and it's pretty impressive. A lot of thanks to go around there. While I can be critical of our friends in the Senate, at the end of the day, they did sit down across the table, and you guys did fashion a deal with them. And it's important to know the administration supports this bill. I mean, the president wants to sign this bill because it achieves a lot of his objectives. He's like everybody else. He would have liked to have some different things in it, and I'm sure if I got to write it all by myself, it would look very different. And I'm sure if my friend from New Jersey and my friend from New York got to write it all by themselves, it would look very different. But the point is, and both of you mentioned it, members had a big level of participation in this. I think you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, at our meeting recently that there were well over 20,000 member requests. I mean, I know in my bill alone there are 10,800 member requests to deal with. So, again, we could all have a different product, but this one really is the product of a thorough process that's gone through every step of the committee. It's been subject to give and take and compromise by both parties in both chambers, plus the President of the United States. So I think you're to be commended. Let me just end with this. I think this is, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, probably from an administration standpoint, probably from the Republican standpoint, the defense gains were the most important single objective that we had here. But there are other priorities in here, too, that other people had, and we tried to work together. There's lots of things people wanted that they didn't get on both sides of the aisle, but where we made the investments in things like the National Institute of Health, there was broad bipartisan commitment, or things like early childhood education, broad bipartisan commitment, or TRIO, or Gear Up. Some of us would have preferred to spend a little less money on the domestic side. Some of us would have preferred to spend a little more money on the domestic side. But the point is, it was a compromise, and it was a compromise in the end of the day could put together the votes on both sides of the aisle that need to happen. This is, as long as the Senate has its rules, and frankly, as long as both parties have the diversity of opinion that they do within them, you're going to have votes from both sides of the aisle to actually move this product. That's just the reality. And the alternative to passing this is a government shutdown. Unacceptable, I would think. Both sides tried that. I think both sides, I hope, have learned something from that. It doesn't work. It doesn't succeed. And in the end of the day, you got to keep the wheels of government turning. You've got to defend the country. You've got to pay the men and women in uniform that are doing the tough jobs. We ask them, give them the best training, give them the best equipment. And you've got to do the things here at home that are necessary as well. And I always tell people that, somebody asked me once about increasing money at NIH. I said, you probably don't know that we spend $259 billion a year looking after Alzheimer's and dementia patients in Medicaid. $259 billion. So increasing the money at NIH, where you might if you could just slow the onset of the disease by 5 years, you could lower that number by 42%. So it's pretty staggering. So the investments are, you do these things because there's the right thing to do in terms of disease and obviously in terms of taking care of people that are already afflicted with disease, but you try to be smart so you can advance solutions that not only improve their lives, but honestly save us money. So, again, I just want to thank both of you. I know there's always some stressful moments and some sharp exchanges every now and then in our committee and our various subcommittees, but they're frankly sharp exchanges because people care very deeply about the issues. They're never rude. You know, we don't have uncivil people on our committee, and I think that's because both of you have set the example. And you're both exceptional members of Congress. You're both exceptionally good at finding the middle ground that you need to move an appropriations bill. So I couldn't be prouder of each one of you. I couldn't be prouder of our committee, and look forward to what I hope is a good debate. There'll be different points of views. That's fine. But I hope we'll successfully get this done in time, avoid a government shutdown, and then get about the business of producing the next bills. We're already having our hearings, and hopefully we will do it in a little more timely fashion this year. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Thank our witnesses, and I'll yield back.
Chairman Cole, thank you very much, and for your diligence, an opportunity to make this a better bill. We appreciate your service very much, and for feedback from the members and your devotion and time to that, as well as Mr. Newhouse. Gentleman from the state of Massachusetts.
Again, thank you both for your service and for all the hours that you and your staff put into this. I have no complaints with you at all. And I trust you both in these negotiations. But I just, again, have to say for the record, I mean, we just got this a couple of hours ago, and I have no idea what's in this thing. I mean, other than what I've been kind of told, I'm worried about what I'm going to find out is in this thing 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks from now. But I guess I just want to make this one point again. This is not even a reflection on the Rules Committee. I'm not even criticizing the Rules Committee. It's the process here. This is a lousy way to do business. There are 435 members here, Democrats and Republicans, liberals, conservatives, moderates. People deserve the right to a better process than this. This is not a criticism of the appropriators or the Rules Committee. It is the people that run this House. You guys have done your work. You and your staff have worked hard enough. You're tired. I'm not going to belabor this. I'm not going to ask any questions. You should go home and go to bed. And thank you, and I yield back.
Great idea.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Thinking about the process that my friend from Massachusetts raised, we happen to have the co-chair of the Joint Select Committee on budget process with us as the ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, and we are up against some artificial deadlines. From the great state of Georgia, we have the honor of having the president who shut the government down the most often, 7 times in 4 years. Jimmy Carter shut the government down, but we dealt with government shutdowns differently. Prior to Ronald Reagan and his Attorney General, his Attorney General redefined what it meant to do a shutdown, and we'll have a chance to talk about that, because I suspect if folks could trade away some line items in the Anti-Deficiency Act in order to take a few more days to digest bills when this kind of thing, unfortunately but inevitably happens, they would take that trade. My only question, because things do sometimes get mistaken in the rush to completion, I found the funding you all included for the Savannah Harbor expansion project, which I appreciated. I wondered if there was a zero missing from that. It is only listed at a $50 million project. Any chance it was supposed to be a $500 million project?
I don't, but we can find out for you.
As long as that's still in the offering, Mr. Chairman, that's all I need.
Your interest will be pursued, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Distinguished gentleman from Florida, Judge Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll thank the chairman and ranking member and echo the sentiments of Mr. McGovern that they and their staffs are to be complimented for the extraordinary time and effort that's put in to this measure. Regrettably, Mr. Chairman, you and my good friend from Oklahoma may very well have some limited knowledge as to things that all of us know that we'll learn about later on, usually a couple of weeks, sometimes even as many as a couple of months before we really know what's in it. But I'm watching Dr. Burgess and my a good friend from Georgia, Mr. Collins, flip pages, and I'm laughing to myself because it clearly indicates to me, among other things, that they don't know what's in this measure, and they're in the majority, so who am I to complain? All things considered, on this committee, those two persons I mentioned, the chairman and Mr. Cole, who does an extraordinary work on appropriations, as well as this committee, may know some of the things that are here. Now, the staff of the Rules Committee, on the minority side, did not receive this 2,000-plus pages until shortly after 8 o'clock. They were given a heads up that it was coming at 8, and then they didn't receive it until shortly after that period of time. Now, these are the people, in the final analysis, that Mr. McGovern, myself, and Mr. Polis rely upon to help us understand some of the particulars of substantive legislation that comes here. It was no way for them to do that in 2 hours. And I shudder to think what happens to non-appropriators and many of us that are referred to as backbenchers that just have absolutely no clue about this. Now, that's just not fair. That's what it boils to. And I'm not talking about from the minority standpoint. I'm talking about to have significant numbers of members who will be voting tomorrow. And all of us know there are a lot of things in this measure that are really good. And all of us know that there are some things in it that are really bad. And when that happens, over and over and over again, most of us sat all day long in our homes or offices and were told at different times that we would be receiving information and that we would be voting, and then we were finally alerted that we would be voting tonight at 9:15. Let me tell you what's wrong with this joint. It's top down. And until, I don't care who is in charge, Republican or Democrat, until such time as it gets bottom up so that everybody has some input, not only to spending measures, but measures within the confines of each of the jurisdictions of this institution, then all of us ought to be damned ashamed of ourselves for producing products like this and coming down every time. I'm here 25 years, and I don't care who has been in the majority. Every time, it's right to the end of the deal. We knew when we came here that there was going to be a need to do these appropriations. And Mr. Frelinghausen and Ms. Lowy and the members of the Appropriations Committee and many members of the Budget Committee did most of their work. And at the very same time, we wait until just before time, and then we're threatened if we don't vote on something or have these kicking the can down the road continuing resolutions at the end of the session. This matter isn't over. We haven't heard, and we will tomorrow, from disparate groups on both sides of the aisle that may not even vote for the rule, may not even vote for the measure, largely for the reason that they, if they wanted to just rest on it, can argue, they don't need for me to vote for this, I don't know what's in it. I was over on the Republican side a moment ago, and I said that I was voting against the journal because I hadn't read the journal. And one of the ladies said, I haven't read it either, but I'm voting for it. And I found it interesting that we do these kinds of things, and the American public thinks that we are a whole bunch of 435 plus 6 responsible people, and yet we find ourselves in positions like this. It's really chaotic, and it's a shame, because there are absolutely brilliant people in this institution on both sides of the aisle that would have an awful lot to say. And I don't care who the top leadership is. At some point in time, I'm not bound to be reliant upon a handful of people telling me what's good not only for my constituents, but for the rest of America. Will we ever cure the problem? No, we won't, because we've grown so accustomed to doing things the same way, and it will require a whole lot to change. Now, I'll make a prediction for you. We'll finish this up on tomorrow. Many of us are going to be attending our dear colleagues' funeral on Friday. I don't think they want to come out of several people being away and getting back at 4:30, weather depending, and then have crisis votes at night. And the old Saturday threat ain't going to work, because you don't want to be here if you're in the majority with the new people that are going to be here in thousands of numbers on Saturday. So we don't want the Capitol open, do we, when we have not passed background checks? We don't want the Capitol open, do we, when we haven't addressed bump stocks and weapons of war? So it would be interesting to see, if we don't get it all done, how quickly a CR will push us over until we come back here after Easter. I thank you, Mr. Frelinghuysen, and this will probably be your last time having to do this junk, but you do it well and you do it fairly. And my good friend, Ms. Lowy, I would trust her to give me exacting information with reference to this matter. And quite frankly, I trust the chairman and Mr. Cole. But I believe all of us know, including these people, y'all are sitting up here, you could go on home. They don't make none of your amendments in order. And you just want to talk, then stay on here and talk. You know, but when the deal goes down, all you're doing is wasting your time. And hopefully your constituents back home will know that you tried. I, for one, think that you should all have your amendments made in order. I think all matters should be able to be voted on by members of this institution. But with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much, and see y'all on tomorrow for yet another waste of time.
Judge Hastings, thank you very much for your insight. Distinguished gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our witnesses for being here. I do need to observe that the House of Representatives did do its appropriations work and had finished it prior to the conclusion of the last fiscal year. It is unfortunate that it took this long to come back and be at this point, and I agree that the process is dysfunctional, and I've spoken to this before. I think we are past the time where it should require 60 votes in the United States Senate to pass an appropriations bill. In the 1970s, it was deemed that it was difficult to pass a budget, and that a budget could pass with a simple majority in the Senate. That's because the budget either spends too much or spends too little. There's always a reason to be against it. That was recognized by the Democrats that were then in charge in the 1970s, and they adjusted in the budget bill at that time that it would only require 51 votes to pass a budget in the United States Senate. My belief is that we are at that point with our standard appropriations bills. They're tough, they're big, they spend too much, they spend too little. There's always a reason to be against it, and hence there's always a reason for inactivity and immobility, and that is what brings us to this point. Now, to both of our witnesses, I have a number of questions, and they're very specific, and I do not expect you to be able to give me a direct answer, but I would hope that someone on your staff could follow up with me on these, because they are important, and they are things that we have worked on together throughout this past year. Many of them were amendments that were heard on the floor of the House when our bills came through that were all passed last September. Mr. Frelinghuysen, I'm on the Energy and Commerce Committee. We deal with the problem of long-term nuclear storage. I would be interested in the dispositions of funds for the continuation of the license application for the long-term nuclear storage at Yucca Mountain. These funds are, of course, provided by a surcharge that have been placed on electrical utility bills for a number of years. It is my belief that those funds should have been obligated for that purpose, and in the past it was not a good idea to have used them for other purposes. I recognize that that may be require a fairly detailed answer. I'll hear what you have to say, but
I chaired the committee. I'm familiar with the issue. I'm familiar with the work that you and Mr. Shimkus have done, but I think there's some interesting dynamics that relate to the city or to the state of New Mexico, which obviously fall into the, the difficulty of sometimes getting these things resolved. I'm a great believer in Yucca Mountain. We've invested like $12 billion there, probably greater than I want to get it reopened. I personally feel that the money was in the budget should be, their money should be in the budget to reopen it. But I think there are some dynamics that flow around the Senate that we have to deal with that maybe the House might not want to deal with, but the Senate, we have to respect the views of the Senate. That it's awkward for some of the senators who represent state of Nevada. But no, it's certainly John Shimkus and others of you have had your shoulder behind the plow for a long time. I'm with you. I have the same ratepayers that are wondering, where that money's, why we can't capitalize on that money. So I'm sympathetic, but I think there's some dynamics more in the Senate that affect the outcome of that issue than in our House.
So the answer is it is not, that issue is not resolved with the passage of
Not
this
resolved with this
appropriations bill.
That's the answer, yeah.
Well, and forgive me, I'm going to jump around on issues just a little bit. Moving to Labor, Health, and Human Services, when we heard the bill on the floor of the House in September, I offered an amendment to fund what are called a National Prescription Drug Monitoring Program. The NASPR program's been authorized the Energy and Commerce Committee. I think going back to 2005, it's been difficult to get it funded. We're up against what has been described as an opiate epidemic. From a physician's standpoint, I will tell you it would be helpful to be able to have a national database to query when you're tasked with writing a narcotic prescription for a patient, and be able to know if someone else in another state has filled a similar prescription on the same day or the day before or the day after. So again, it wasn't a large amount of money that was moved around in the Labor, Health, and Human Services bill, but I would be interested to know.
We have the chairman here. I think in many cases, first of all, we did 700 amendments on the appropriations bills, both in committee and on the floor. And we obviously had an up and down vote where people could show their views. The committee sometimes is tasked to do the work of the authorizers. And quite honestly, if the authorizers did it, we probably wouldn't have it.
We did our work on the authorizing committee.
Yeah, but sometimes your Senate counterparts don't do the work. But I'll yield to the chairman of the committee. But let's say
someone can get back to me.
I'm uncomfortable about doing as much authorizing on the bills that we have. I think Ms. Lowy and I share that. We're not happy about doing that for any number of reasons. We can't get things passed.
But this is one instance in which we had authorized going back to 2005. We authorized repeatedly, and it's not been funded.
We're happy to inquire. I don't have the specific information.
2 weeks ago, the administrator of the Food and Drug Administration took me to the International Mail Facility at JFK Airport. It's up in your neck of the woods. It's startling, the amount of material that is coming into this country that could be classified as contraband, illicit, or downright dangerous. I guess my only observation from that visit was that the physical plant at the International Mail Facility at JFK Airport in Queens, New York, seemed pretty primitive. And I've Mr. Hastings is right. I was looking through the bill to see if I could find where funds are designated for home, I guess, Customs and Border Patrol, Food and Drug Administration. Again, this is more just an observation. We got a big problem on what's coming into this country. We're only inspecting 1/10 of 1%. And if I were a conspiracy theorist, I would believe that another country is trying to undo us with contraband that they're sending us through the United States mail facility. It's just a plea that at some point the dollars are going to have to be available to modernize that facility. It is, the men and women who are working there are working under very, very difficult conditions, and it is a big task that we've given them. Title 42 in the Environmental Protection Agency, Title 42, the ability to pay someone higher than their grade because it's a scientist who's in high demand. This was originally started in the Department of Health and Human Services for scientists at the National Institute of Health. I support that. I think it's important. However, in the Environmental Protection Agency, it does seem that they've used this Title 42 authority and extended it to entry-grade chemists and toxicologists. Again, I had an amendment in the Interior Appropriations Bill last September to limit the amount of Title 42 positions that would be available in the Environmental Protection Agency. And again, I don't expect you to know this, but perhaps your staff could follow up with me as to where.
Gentlemen,
Yes,
I think we actually did fund the area that you've questioned. I've just actually been advised by staff we did. They're listening in, so.
On the
PD
International Mail Facility? Oh, the PDMP?
Yeah.
Okay.
That is fun.
Going back 2 issues ago. Thank you.
Well,
we appreciate
you're
it.
a hard man to keep up with, Doctor.
Moving right along, an issue that I've brought to the appropriations process every year for the past several years has been the issue of what's called now known as the light bulb amendment. I don't recall seeing it in anything that I've seen written about this appropriation. And again, I don't expect you to know that, but perhaps your staff could get back with me about what has happened with the light bulb amendment. And then just finally, the story that we had a couple of weeks ago about the bridge that collapsed in Florida. That seemed to me to be a new design that was being used, and I was just curious, as on the appropriations level, have we looked into any of the funding of those types of projects? We do need to make sure that, I'm all for innovation, but it does need to be safe. And again, I don't expect you to know the answer to that, but perhaps someone on your staff could get back with me. And we do appreciate you being here. I know I know this is a difficult process. I really want to thank you for the work that you did with me on getting the dollars necessary for the federal match for the Medicaid in Puerto Rico. The last bill, I think we did get that squared away, and that was a victory. So I appreciate the work that you did on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. As the gentleman has noted, your distinguished staff member, Shannon O'Keefe, is in the back taking copious notes about this, but I would ask that the gentleman, in that he has a staff member with him, would write down these issues, that you would ask the gentleman. Certainly, Shannon's going to take care of that. Will tell you, I run across this young woman a lot, and she's pretty sharp at getting answers back, so I know she'll want to do that for Chairman Burgess. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got this bill, and I understand it. Is it correct? It spends $1.3 trillion, Mr. Chairman, approximately. And we're being asked to read this bill with only hours before this committee marks it up, the only committee that marks it up. I've prepared a few amendments that I'll offer. Would you be open to some amendments to the bill? I would ask the chair.
I think I have to yield to the chairman of the committee. I'm not sure what your rules and procedures are here, but let me just say for the record, we passed substantially the same bills you have in front of us back in September. What we've done is added more money for defense and more money for domestic spending into existing categories within our bills, but substantially the bills are basically what was debated and discussed
Yeah, we're
months
claiming my
ago.
time. I mean, you're basically saying they're the same except for everything's different. You said they're the same, and then we added defense and non-defense. That's 100% of spending. I mean, you said they're the same, and then we changed all of it, is what you're telling me.
Gentlemen, yield.
Yeah.
I need to go back to my opening statement where I delineated where there were additions to those things, and I will get the gentleman a copy of that. I would also direct the gentleman what might be in his packet, it was in our packet, of a breakdown of many of the items that might be included that would break down where those additional.
Yeah, and the problem is it's not so much a one-page summary. We're trying to understand. I mean, me and my
5
staff.
pages.
Yeah, 5 pages. Yeah. So we're trying to figure out what's in this and what's not. Mr. Chairman.
I am completely with you, gentlemen. All I'm saying is we have done some bit of homework for you to help you in that regard.
No, and that will be helpful, but there are many programs, as you know, that are important to our constituents that have funding levels that aren't in the summary. We have to actually find them in the bill, and this is $1.3 trillion in spending that I guess we're going to have to stay up all night reading, but we still won't. It's just hard to read this much in one day. And I think, more importantly, it's money we don't have. I would just ask the chairman, how much of the $1.3 trillion we're spending is deficit spending?
Not sure I'm qualified to say that, but the general view is a lot of what we're doing here.
Well, I mean, you're the one proposing the spending, Mr.
For the
Chairman,
last 30 years, we've been doing quite a lot of deficit spending, with all due respect, Mr. Polis.
Yeah, I mean, but if you're proposing that we spend $1.3 trillion, I'd like you to tell us whether we have it or not. I don't think we have it. It's my understanding that this could be, I wish you knew, you're in a better position than me to know, that it could be $800-900 billion deficit. How much deficit spending are we talking about?
Gentleman, yield.
Happy to.
We have a gentleman who is our budget expert who is here, but he would be better able, but I will try and answer your question, if I could, with the distinguished gentleman. As you know, this is discretionary spending only. Discretionary spending is about 38% of all the spending. I could characterize this as none of the money that would add to the deficit. We could say, based upon saying that it's the 60% that would cause the deficit, not the 38%. But what I'm suggesting to you is I do not think that the gentleman would need to answer that question, because we have asked him based upon a budget, a proposal which was voted on, which we understood, and then came back and several weeks ago added to the budget caps that spending level. So I think it's appropriate to say, did you stay within the caps? None of it would be deficit spending, in essence, would be my answer.
Well, yeah, and with all due respect, Mr. Chairman, that's just not. It's more money. We're spending more money than we take in. I mean, what
not with this.
The way the deficit is calculated, it understates the real problem. I mean, I think we agree on that, because it doesn't include the entitlement programs and the mandatory spending in the deficit. This is the discretionary spending, and the discretionary spending deficit alone is going to be $700-900 billion. That is different than the mandatory spending side. If there's somebody from the Budget Committee, they can tell me, what is this deficit spending going to be, Mr. Woodall?
Well, as the chairman explained, this is not a revenue measure. This is just a spending measure. So the deficit has two components. How much do you bring in?
Well,
and
the
how much
revenues are set.
Out?
We did what we did, and we know we have projections of what they're going to be. So now we're going to simply subtract the spending.
If the gentleman would yield.
Happy to.
If you're funding Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security and interest on the national debt, if you're funding national security, and if you're funding all of the non-defense priorities that we have identified, we're going to run a deficit about the size of the non-defense discretionary spending that's in this bill. But you can address that 1,000 different ways. It doesn't have anything to do with this bill. It has to do with whether or not you're going to deal with revenues. What are you going to do with payroll? Are you going to take care of our
reclaiming my time? This is the only bill they're letting us vote on. You're not letting us vote on any of that other spending. This is the one spending bill, which is $1.3 trillion, that we get to vote on. And then you're saying, oh, blame the part we're not letting you vote on, but yet there's a deficit.
No,
So
just
happy to yield for the gentleman.
Would yield. I'm not saying blame anything at all. I'm just saying you can't ask the Appropriations Chairman about how much deficit exists in his bill. The Appropriations Chairman, in my 7 years in this body, has never spent 1 penny more than the Budget Committee has allocated him. Never, never, ever. Never 1 penny more than the budget has allocated. Now, if you want to say the budget is unbalanced, you'd be right to do so, but as frustrated as I can be about federal spending and taxes and revenues and mandatory spending, it has never been the ranking member's fault. It has never been the chairman's fault. No matter how high or how low the numbers are we've given them, they have never failed to deliver what the body has asked for.
Yeah, and reclaiming my time, what I'm asking for is a very simple calculation. It's how much we are spending more than what we take in. I realize this isn't the tax bill. We have our tax projections. This is a spending bill of $1.3 trillion. We simply subtract that from our revenues and we wind up with a very large deficit. I'm just trying to figure out how big this deficit is that this Republican massive spending bill is proposing.
If the gentleman would yield one more
Happy
time.
to yield back.
If the gentleman, if all the gentleman chooses to spend in fiscal year 18 is the money that's in this bill and the money we've spent to this point in the fiscal year, we will run a surplus for fiscal year 2018.
Reclaim my time, that's an imaginary world. You're only letting us vote on this spending. We all agree there's, 60% of spending we're not seeing or voting on, and you're increasing the 40% by, I believe, 15% is how much the increase is, or something along those lines. So absent that 15% increase, the budget deficit would be significantly lower, like $100 billion lower.
The gentleman would yield one
Happy
more
to.
time. I share the gentleman's frustration. I take his point. I only wanted to increase the defense side of the spending. There's about $100 billion in the deal that we made that I didn't want to spend, but somebody else negotiated that side of the deal and won. I would say it was your side.
Well, no,
that
they haven't won unless you vote for it.
We're all in this.
Reclaiming my time. I mean, they haven't won. We can vote no on this. It's not like you have to vote yes. You don't want the spending, vote no. I'm telling you, I don't want the spending. I'm voting no. So join me if you don't want the spending. I mean, this is outrageous. It is 1 point. It is. We're heading towards $1 trillion deficit with this bill. I mean, we really are. You're saying, oh, there's a mandatory piece and that's what's causing it, but then you're not even doing anything to talk about any of that. In fact, you're increasing the mandatory piece because you're increasing the federal debt, and part of the mandatory piece is the interest on the federal debt. And of course, if interest rates spike, which they could because of this fiscal irresponsibility that's bankrupting our government, the interest on the federal debt will only go up more. Happy to yield.
If the gentleman would yield one more time, we don't have to vote against the pay raises for our men and women in uniform. They're in this bill in order to balance the budget. We don't have to do that. I believe you're offering us a false choice. We could put work requirements on some of our mandatory spending programs and ask that folks go out and seek jobs. We could put means testing on some of our benefit programs and ask that folks who have been very successful in life ask for a little bit less from their government. It's a false choice that you're offering our chairman.
Reclaiming my time. It's simply a choice to spend less. I mean, we could have stuck to the budget caps and passed the bill, and instead Republicans chose to just have a huge federal expenditures, spend more and more taxpayer money we don't have, increasing taxes on future generations, raising the deficit. You're proposing now things that Democrats don't support, obviously cutting benefits to programs that people need. But the simplest way to balance a budget is just not to spend the money, and we could do that by voting no today.
If I could
I'm
ask
going to vote no.
one last
to.
opportunity to yield, I thank you. My commitment to you, because I know you're sincere in your beliefs, any deal for a lower level of spending that you can negotiate through the Democrats in the United States Senate, you have my support for. But I've been waiting since we passed our appropriations bills last September for such a deal, and I'm being told by both of our witnesses this is the best deal they can get.
Mr. Woodall,
for you and me.
every time we've had this, at the budget phase, the expenditure phase, every CR, I've offered spending cuts, and this committee hasn't let them go to the House. So if we want this to give the Senate a chance to agree, approve my spending cuts. I'm going to offer one again tonight, a spending cut. I've offered a dozen spending cuts to these bills and budget, and every single one has died in this committee. So, of course, the Senate can't agree if we can't even get it to the floor of the House and out. I think my spending cuts would pass in the House. When we used to have appropriations bills, I succeeded in passing a couple when we actually used to bring them up on the floor. But Republicans just want to spend more money, and you're trying to dress it up every way from Sunday, but you're bankrupting the American Republic by spending more than we have. That's what this bill does. We do have an option. The option is to vote no. I'm going to vote no tonight in Rules Committee unless you allow my spending cuts to go through, and I'm going to vote no on the floor. And once we move forward, we can absolutely cut this budget, and that will cut the deficit.
I appreciate the gentleman's feedback.
Thank you. I'd be going back to the chairman. I just want to ask if there's any spending in this $1.3 trillion spending bill that you would consider unnecessary that you think we could cut.
We've negotiated this, Republicans and Democrats, since we got this cap deal here. And I've worked very closely with both the chairs and ranking of all 12 committees. And I feel strongly that everything we put in here is defensible. We've had.
So there's nothing.
That's my answer.
So there's no government waste.
I think it's defensible.
You're saying there's no waste in this $1.3 trillion. There's nothing we can cut.
I think my response is the accurate one. We work to make sure that not a dollar is wasted. We've called for accountability in every one of our bills and oversight. We work with the authorizers to make sure that there's even more accountability. I feel satisfied we're headed in the right direction.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield.
My chairman's in a tough spot. To be fair, waste is in the eye of the beholder. The Appropriations Committee didn't ask for this much money. They marked up bills with less money. So by definition, there is more in here than the chairman and the ranking member tried to put in here. They ended up with the deal they ended up with, and we can House, Senate, Republicans, Democrats. But just understand, I didn't want you to think that the chairman was evading your.
No, he wasn't evading it. He said that all the spending in here is defensible. He said there's no waste. I mean,
I'm just saying. Remember, our colleagues did a better job for us the first time around. Dealt a second hand. I hope they've done, and I believe them when they tell me they have done the best they could do with that second hand. But we often get in the habit of looking at appropriators if they're the ones who are taking money out of our pockets. They passed a bill that would have saved us money, one that you and I supported more than we support this one. The answer came back no from the Senate Republicans and Democrats, and now we are where we are tonight. But I wouldn't want to characterize this as the chairman and the ranking member's first choice. It wasn't. We passed their first choice. This is their second choice about how to get us across the finish.
Well, I mean, so second, third, fourth choice, the deficit gets bigger and bigger. I would say there is a lot to find in this bill that we can cut. And if we haven't cut that, we haven't done our work, and you're not giving us a chance to do our work, because we're seeing this bill. I'm going to offer some amendments. I hope they pass, but I've offered similar ones before, and they failed. This is just no way to run a country. I mean, I just can't imagine that we're spending more than we have, but we can't find out exactly how much more. The bill, none of us have time to read it. We're not even considering that there could be any waste in the entire federal budget or expenditures. And I'm talking things that Democrats and Republicans can agree on are wasteful. To my colleague from Georgia, I'm not saying ideological things where it's stuff that Republicans want to get rid of or Democrats want to get rid of. I'm saying it's stuff that we can just say, wait a second, why is the federal government spending money on this when states can do it better, when charity can do it better, when we should not be taking that money from taxpayers that we don't have and plunging our nation deeper into debt? So the answer to me is simple. It's just to reject this, because then we can go forward and simply spend less. And I know we're not going to completely eliminate the budget deficit on the discretionary side. I get that. But this bill increases it above and beyond what it used to be under the budget caps that Democrats and Republicans agreed to, that I supported. I don't know if the gentleman from Georgia supported, but I supported those caps. And now we're spending not just more, like 15% more. I mean, that's like bigger than the size of the GDP of most countries that we're spending more. Money we don't have, mortgaging our children's future. I'm the father of a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. There's no way I could vote for this bill and look them in the face, knowing that we'd be leaving a legacy of debt for the next generation. So I'll be offering my amendments in a little bit. I hope this committee will allow them to proceed to the floor. But I strongly encourage the committee and the House to reject this bill and finally work towards balancing the budget rather than making the budget deficit even bigger. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman, just back his time. Thank you very much. The distinguished gentleman from Georgia.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I think the interesting issues going around. I think the chairman, ranking member for this. I think for some of the things that have been put in. Again, I don't think, contrary to what was just said, I don't think anybody would say that you could not find something that we would cut here. I think this is the end of the day what they brought forth. We take what they're giving, you decide your vote the next day how you wish. I think the other things that we look at here, I agree with my friend from Georgia, there's probably a typo error in that zero on the Savannah Harbor project, which has been talked about for many, many years and approved by multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat. Like to see that more. Also, protection of privacy and other things for Law Enforcement and Cloud Act. We do appreciate that. And also some mental health aspects. It was in the Criminal Justice and Mental Health Act, fully funded, was also something that helps us as we look forward for law enforcement to be able to identify mental health as we go forward. So there are things here that, to look at. There are also things we can always disagree on. I just thank the work, and I appreciate y'all being here this evening. I yield back.
Distinguished gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Mr. Chairman, is there 1 penny appropriated in this bill to Planned Parenthood?
To the chairman of the committee.
No. There's never been a bill passed by the United States Congress that appropriated money to Planned Parenthood. What there is family planning money, Title X money. The administration, the last one, now this one, makes the decision on who gets a grant. But we've never, ever passed an appropriations bill that directed money to Planned Parenthood.
So we would be relying upon the discretion of the Trump administration and whether or not any of this money would go to Planned Parenthood.
That is correct.
I think I know the answer to that question. The President's just tweeted out his support for the bill in part because there's $1.6 billion for a border wall. So I appreciate the hard work y'all have done on it. A lot of us have a lot of homework to do on this bill. There's still a lot of reading we've got to do on it, but what I've seen so far, I think the two of you have done yeoman's work. I know how hard y'all work on it. I deeply appreciate the time that you and your staff spend on it. You listen to people, and though there's not everything I want in this bill, and there were some things I'd rather do a little bit differently, I do very much appreciate the fact you listen to us and you work so very hard on it. Thank you, sir, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, distinguished gentleman from Alabama. How about the distinguished gentleman from the state of Washington?
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's almost midnight.
Yes,
Thank you for recognizing me. And I appreciate all the debate on both sides of the aisle tonight. I especially want to thank our chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Mr. Frelinghuysen, as well as our fine ranking member, Ms. Lowy. Being one of the newest members of the Appropriation Committee, I can't tell you how proud I was to be a part of the effort this past summer. We spent a lot of late nights together, getting to know each other quite well, working very hard, getting all 12 of the appropriations bills across the finish line. And I'm sure it didn't have anything to do with me being finally on the committee, but we were able to do that the first time in many years. But it really was a positive experience. I felt that members of the committee had a tremendous amount of input. There was good debate on many, many aspects of these the appropriations bills that we were able to produce and pass off the House floor and move to the Senate, which, as at least one of our members on the dais suggested, was almost 180 days ago, a long time, whatever amount of time it was. And the Senate was unable to even move one of those bills. And so we find ourselves in this last month with a process that, quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, I have been less than excited about. I have not felt that we have had the communication necessarily that has been good to have all members be engaged in this process. And I'm not throwing cold water on the work of the chairman or the ranking member, but it's the process that we have in front of us that was agreed to by those at a higher pay grade than we are. And just to be frank with you, I think that this has been very frustrating, that even members of the Appropriations Committee did not have the transparency or the ability to be able to move things in this legislation that I think they should have. I don't think, and for different reasons than my friends across the aisle, I share some of the frustration that was expressed this evening by you. We didn't necessarily have a lot of time. We got the text of the bill same time you did.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
Exactly the same time.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
Just for one moment, because I know how you can go on, Mr. Polis.
Oh no, that's a gentleman from Florida. You're thinking. That's a gentleman from Florida. You're thinking. Briefly, no. I just took issue when you said it was above our pay grade because every member of the House, the Appropriations Chair, us, everybody makes the same salary. We all get one vote on the floor, and I think it's just deferring responsibility if you say it's somebody else, it's their pay grade.
reclaiming my time.
We're all equal.
Reclaiming my time. It was just a figure of speech to say above our pay grade. I mean higher up in leadership abilities here. But frustration is on both sides. It's shared on both sides. As a member of the committee, I felt that there should have been more engagement by rank and file members of the entire body, so I'm sorry that there was not. No. And from our perspective, and you would disagree with this, but one of my biggest frustration is that we have actually ceded our majority power to the minority in this process. When we have a four corners process that needs a unanimous agreement from all members of those four corners to get anything passed in an omnibus bill, to me, what's the point of having a majority and a minority? We have lost our ability to move our priorities. And so I felt that there was a lack of our ability to govern as we have been elected to do so because of that, and I feel bad about that. I feel it's evident here that there's a number of members that also feel frustrated because they're here to, I'm assuming, not just to stay and spend the evening with us, but to offer amendments that they would like to see to perfect this bill. And I applaud them for doing that, and I'm sure that there are many more that would like to be here as well. I share that frustration. I'm going to be offering an amendment myself, Mr. Polis, just like you, to try to make this a better bill, things that I think could have been accepted and agreed to and voted off the floor, but because at least one of four individuals disagreed that it was a good idea, we are not considering it this evening. So it's overall, I think the process, like I said, originally was good. We got off to a great start, and I have to give a lot of credit to the hard work of these two individuals that are in front of us, this committee this evening. But I think the process needs a lot of improvement, and I think we have to do a better job because, as has been said, this is one of the biggest areas of decision that we make as a Congress. All of you have mentioned your kids and your grandkids and the next generation and the debt that we are saddling those young people with is not a responsible action for us to take, and we need to do better at that. And I would think that with the engagement of the entire body, we can do better at that, and I will work hard to make sure that this process improves to the point where we can all be proud of it. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time.
Mr. Newhouse, thank you very much. Yielding back his time, I would say to the distinguished young chairman that the gentleman, Mr. Newhouse, sits on your committee, distinguished member of this committee. He has tried his darndest to have conversations, to have things added to the bill that evidently were not. He could be a disgruntled member. He recognizes in some discussions that we've had that it will hurt his district. Most plainly, he was attempting to represent. But he also understands that there are things that also have priorities and that it's part of what this entire process is about. We want to thank you both, not only for taking the time to be with us, but for your jovial consideration of all of the requests that have come with you for months and months and months. And I will tell you, Shannon is doing an awesome job. Your staff, our staffs, work quite well with you. We appreciate your adherence to our feedback and doing the very best that you can. It's my hope that as you leave this evening, you'll be prepared for discussion tomorrow. I understand that we're going to be up at about 9:30 a.m. To begin, and we'll see if we can get our work done tomorrow. The main effort here is to make sure that the United States military and the government receives money that it needs to make sure we keep the men and women who protect this great nation, also on our borders, federal law enforcement, first responders, taken care of. And I want to thank both of you for your adherence to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay, we do have some very special guests that are taking time, who've spent a great deal of time with us. We're going to call up the second panel. Second panel, obviously, would be prepared as they would choose to be recognized. I don't know who is in what order necessarily for your amendment, so I'm going to say the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Chairman, we're delighted that you're here.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, would be here. The gentleman, Mr. Massey. The gentleman, Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry, Mr. Weber. Mr. Weber, do you wish to join? Once again, I'm not sure who else wants to come. Mr. Biggs, Mr. Garrett, Mr. Heiss, Mr. Mooney. We've got chairs. Chairs abound. I saw Jody Heiss, who was here. I don't know if he's still. Mr. Mooney, Mr. Garrett, do you intend? All right, sir. I would ask the clerk, Miss Booth, if you would please make available one more chair next to Mr. Biggs. But both of you, you'd like to be on the next panel? That'd be fine. That'd be fine. We're delighted that you're here. Thank you for taking time. I will tell you that this is an important thing you're doing. I know you feel strongly about your duty and obligation as a member of Congress. We take that obligation seriously also. We're delighted that you're here, Mr. Chairman. We will go and yield to you first. I would simply ask that anything that you brought in writing would be available for our awesome stenographer, allowing her to complete the record. She speaks Texan, but I'm sure she'll understand Mr. Weber, but you know, anybody from Kentucky might need to provide something in writing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that kind introduction. Happy birthday, a day early. We brought some presents, some great amendments that we hope you'll accept and make this bill a better piece of legislation. And I would love to yield to my, my distinguished colleague from Kentucky, who has our First Amendment, which deals with Second Amendment rights. So if it's okay with the chairman, I'll let Mr. Massey.
Great. Tom, thank you very much. You're recognized. If the gentleman would please refer to the amendment number that he has, that would help us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is offered by myself and Mr. Jordan. I'm not sure what number has been assigned to it by the committee here. I do appreciate the opportunity to appear in front of you.
I think it's number 3.
Okay. Amendment number 3, it would merely strike page, line 5 on page 1982 and all that follows through page 1998, line 8. And I would just summarize the effect of this amendment by saying that it removes the gun control provision from the omnibus, the fixed NICS title that was put in this omnibus. Let me just start out by what my impression of what fixed NICS attempts to do is. That's the portion of the bill that we want to remove, where we would like to remove, if our amendment is made in order and if it were to pass. Fixed NICS ostensibly puts pressure on every agency within the administration to turn more names into the NICS database. It doesn't specifically name the agencies within the administration, but this would include, for instance, the Veterans Administration. It also puts pressure on the courts, the state courts and the federal courts and the military courts to turn over names into the NICS database. And it provides money as an inducement to the states to improve their reporting of names in the NICS database. Here's the problem with putting names in the database. In 2010, the last year that the ATF gave us this information, we know that there were 76,000 denials of instant background check purchases. Only 48 of those denials were referred for prosecution to federal court. 28 were prosecuted, and 13 resulted in convictions. So of the 76,000 denials, there were only 13 federal convictions. So from that, I have to believe that most of those denials were false positives or some problem with the system. If we put more names into the system, what you will get are far more false positives. And the problem is the NICS background check hasn't stopped a school shooting or a mass public shooting, and that's what a lot of people are using as the motivation for introducing this language into the omnibus. The second thing I want to say is that this NICS, fixed NICS bill was attached. It passed the House once before when it was inserted in another bill that was for reciprocity, that would allow national concealed carry reciprocity. There was a promise that was made to a lot of members that the fixed NICS language would not come back to the floor unless it was an integral part, unless it included the reciprocity language. Because at the time, I warned my colleagues that this fixed NICS language was going to come back without reciprocity, and that they should not allow it. At the time, we tried to avoid the rule. Some of us voted against the rule that connected fixed NICS and reciprocity because we were worried about this very thing. So 40 members of Congress in the majority signed a letter saying they would not vote for fixed NICS if it came back without the reciprocity language. So what I'm trying to do here really is make it more likely in an odd way that the omnibus will pass, because 40 people, 40 members of the majority have already said this is a poison pill, and they put that in a writing, in writing, in a letter to the Speaker and the other leadership. Just if I may have some more time, I want to go through the history here of fixed NICS in the House, the recent history. 2007, there was a bill that was passed. It was called the NICS Improvement Amendments Act. Passed the House and the Senate by voice vote, so nobody went on record on this. Later on, that bill became a rule in the previous administration, the Obama administration, at the Social Security Administration, that said if you have a representative payee, that you were going to lose your right to own a firearm. Not only would you be put into the NICS database, but you also can't legally own ammunition or a firearm at that point. So that, and in fact, the bill or the rule that the Obama administration came up with was called Implementation of the NICS Improvement Amendments Act of 2007. When the presidency changed and we stayed in the majority in the House and the Senate, we promptly offered a bill using the Congressional Review Act. And what this bill did is it repealed that rule. It turned back that rule. And what it did is it said that Congress disapproves the rule submitted by the Social Security Administration relating to the implementation of the NICS Improvement Amendments Act of 2007. So here you have the NICS Improvement Amendments Act of 2007 pass. You have the Obama administration use that at the Social Security Administration, and I would say also at the VA. I want to get to that later. And then Congress comes in and reverses that ruling by effectively repealing the implementation of the 2007 Act. But tonight, here we get from the whip team, they say that this Fixed NICS Act reauthorizes the NICS Improvement Act. So we got a little bit of schizophrenia going on here, or a little flip-flopping among the majority. We remanded a rule, and now that was caused or enabled by the 2007 NICS Improvement Act, and now we're going and we're reauthorizing that bill that enabled that rule. So just a little bit of history there. One other piece of history I want to mention, we have not changed any of the policies at the VA. At the VA, you have veterans who are losing the right to keep and bear arms every day through paperwork. It does not go through a judicial system. It's purely administrative. If they do so much as just to say to the person interviewing them, somebody else manages my finances, then they can administratively lose their right to own a firearm without going through a judge. That, I want to be clear, that is happening now. That's happened in the past few years. The Fixed NICS bill will make that worse because it will apply more pressure to the Veterans Administration to more diligently report those veterans' names into the database. And I've had employees at the VA, 2 employees who've called me confidentially and shared paperwork, casework with me, showing how a veteran loses their rights without a judge being involved. This troubles me greatly. It troubled our whole Congress because last year we passed a bill, H.R. 1181, called the Veterans Second Amendment Protection Act, which would have fixed that problem at the VA, that lack of due process. A lot of members went to the floor and debated in favor of that. Nearly every member of the majority voted for it. Some members of the minority voted for that to fix this problem at the VA. And it didn't pass in the Senate because it wasn't eligible for the Congressional Review Act, required 60 votes. I suppose they didn't think they had the 60 votes there. So this problem still exists at the VA. Every member of the majority knows it. And the fix NICS bill language that's in the omnibus is going to exacerbate that problem. It will result in more veterans losing their right to keep and bear arms. And I just want to close by saying you can go back and look at all the cases. There's not a school shooting that would have been prevented by implementing this Fix NICS Act. The ball that was dropped in Florida was at the FBI, and that particular lack of diligence, I would say, is not addressed by the Fix NICS Act. Now, some might say the shooting in Florida at the church could have been prevented if the military had submitted those names more diligently. But here's the thing, if you really wanted to do this properly, instead of telling every branch of the administration, every agency, like the VA, for instance, that you've got to submit names, you should just go to the courts and say that, because the courts are really the only place, whether it's a state court, federal court, or a military court, where you should ever be stripped of your right of any right, frankly, and especially the right to keep and bear arms for a veteran who has taken up arms to defend our Constitution. And with that, I want to yield to my co-sponsor here, Mr. Jim Jordan from Ohio.
Well, I want to thank the chairman of the Second Amendment Caucus for that thorough explanation. I would just say, look, this is a violation of due process rights when it comes to American citizens. Bureaucrats would be and have the ability to take away their fundamental Second Amendment liberties and not a court of law. And second, I would just point out this is a fundamental violation of what our leadership told us they were going to do. When we passed the legislation that had the NICS issue and the reciprocity issue married together on the House floor via the rule, we were assured by our leadership this bill would not come back by itself, would not be placed on any must-pass legislation without the reciprocity language. Obviously, that's not the case with the language that's in the current omnibus. And for those reasons, I support the gentleman's amendment.
So just to summarize, the amendment strikes 16 pages from the omnibus. It strikes the entire Fix NICS language portion that's in the omnibus bill. And that would be 16 pages less you'd have to read tonight of the 2,232 pages.
Thank you very much, Mr. Massey. Mr. Weber?
Chairman, with your indulgence, I would like to be on this second panel.
The gentleman will be on the second panel. The gentleman, Mr. Perry. Distinguished gentleman, Mr. Perry, thank you for your service to our nation as a member of the United States Armed Forces, including, I believe, the United States Army, and your distinguished service on behalf of not only the Army, but the young men and women that you led, and we want to thank you again for your service.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this opportunity. I'm here as a sympathetic voice to the amendment that Mr. Massey, my friend from Kentucky, has offered. I lament that I was not listed as a co-sponsor, but I'm hoping that my presence here today will indicate my strong support and for all the reasons that Mr. Massey and Mr. Jordan have already stated. I would also include, for me, it's a due process issue. You don't take somebody's constitutional rights, I don't care which right it is, away without due process. This measure that's being added in the omnibus allows that to continue. It's happening now, it allows it to continue, and even worse, it codifies it in law. And I would say that every single one of us here, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, anyone in between, people that aren't elected officials, people that are just serving, everybody walking the country wants this gun violence to end. And if you really want to do something to the NICS program, fix it so that it's more than just a name and a town location that goes in where they check they check your name and their town location. If there's a criminal in your town that has a similar name, you're going to show up, which is the 70-some thousand false positives that Mr. Massey talked about. If they would just use your Social Security number, that would be your positive identification, and that would prove who you are and whether you were eligible to buy a firearm or not. This is not going to solve the problem that we have in our country, and we're all going to walk away. Some of us are going to feel better about it, and some of us are going to know better that we haven't done a thing to make our country safer. At the same time, many of us are going to know that while we haven't made our country safer, we have abridged the rights of our fellow citizens, and most egregiously, as Mr. Massey has already informed you, those who have taken up arms in defense of the ideal, the ideas of America and our rights. And that, to me, is just something that I think that cooler heads and clear heads should prevail on, and not have this schizophrenia back and forth in the heat of the moment, and be measured and do the right thing here, and strip that language out of this bill and take up that language at some other time where we can debate it fully and get to a solution that actually makes a difference to keep our kids and our society safe. And with that, I yield the balance.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Mr. Biggs, welcome to the Rules Committee. We're delighted that you're with us. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an honor to be in front of this committee again. The last time was on the day after I got sworn in, and I had to withdraw all of my amendments. But this time I'm hoping for better luck. And I'm reminded of something former Arizona Congressman Mo Udall said. He used to say, everything's been said, it just hasn't been said by everyone yet. So with that, I'm going to yield back at this time. Just before I shouldn't say that, because I'm going to say that I am strongly supportive of Mr. Massey's amendment. I think he's done an excellent job explicating why. And so with that, I yield.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We do recognize Mr. Massey spoken for you, and you are in support of this. I know the gentleman, Mr. Weber, does too. I have a few questions. We're going to defer to the distinguished gentlewoman from Wyoming to lead the questions. The gentlewoman's recognized. The gentlewoman does not seek time. The gentleman, Mr. Cole. No question. All right. The gentleman, Mr. Polis.
Yes. I have some amendments that I'll present in the next panel.
Thank you very much. I'll defer to myself. Mr. Massey, you indicated that there might be an answer to this that you just cannot figure out yet. You were seeing it for the first time, the language. Do you believe that there is an instance, not about whether the reciprocity piece, but about the piece of the next fix that might be a mistake? Do you think it might be written wrong, read wrong? Do you think it didn't equally intend to go back and pick up this piece from the prior legislation, or do you think this was the real intent?
Well,
I'm not suggesting
right.
somebody made a mistake. I'm suggesting, do you think that it's not what we had understood would be in that place?
Actually, the fixed NICS that passed the House included a manager's amendment that I believe was offered by Chairman Goodlatte that changed some of the language. This language here is a reversion back to, I believe, the original language that Senator Cornyn offered in the Senate. And so you could say it's semantics, whether you're reauthorizing a 2007 bill or whether you're authorizing this. It's still correct to say you're authorizing it, even if you're reauthorizing it.
Get that.
But what I wanted to point out was that there is that linkage between the 2007 bill, which became the gun ban at the Social Security Administration, and which made the one at the VA worse, and then this language that's being introduced tonight. In fact, it's being represented now tonight because it is the Cornyn language, and the Cornyn language does say reauthorize the 2007 NICS Improvement Amendments Act, or portions of it, whereas the Goodlatte language, the manager's amendment, did strike that. I don't believe it's a mistake. I do believe that this bill does reauthorize portions of that 2007 bill, and what my point is, we should be very wary of supplanting that 2007 bill, because that's what became in title. In fact, it's called, the rule at the Social Security Administration is called Implementation of the 2007 NICS Improvement Amendments Act. So why would we want to reauthorize any part of that? That's my concern. And then my other concern that I expressed, which you might be referring to, so I'll just mention this or try to clarify it, is that I think if you were seeking to solve the problem in Texas, where the military did not submit that name, you could do it without the due process issue if you just told the courts, turn over these names, instead of going to telling the entire administration, turn over all the names you've got. Now, because the NICS database is fraught with problems and there are a lot of false positives, I would not, in fact, be in favor of pressuring the courts to put more names in it until, as Mr. Perry from Pennsylvania said, you fix this false positive issue. And this fixed NICS bill doesn't address the false positive issue. It really doesn't fix NICS. It will cause more names to go in. not under new categories, maybe under, the administration will seek to define and broaden sometimes these categories. It doesn't create new categories. But what they did at the VA is they said, look, if you don't manage your own money, we're going to put you in that category that says you are mentally defective for the purposes of owning a gun. And I think that's a bad judgment to make just at an administrative level and just as a matter of fact, because that's just not necessarily true. There are some people, in fact, a lot of veterans spend their entire career letting their wives manage their money because they're not home to pay the mortgage when the bill shows up. And so in retirement, they go into that same mode. And I have heard from a caseworker, in fact, I know a couple who has spoken to me where the man said, my wife manages the finances, and in this administrative process, he lost his right, not just his right to own a gun, but his right to have one in the house. So in the process, she loses her right to own a gun. And so here you have a couple that doesn't have their basic constitutional right to defend themselves merely because the husband said in an interview, my wife manages the finances. And this Fix NICS will exacerbate that because what it says is, we're going to take your bonuses away at the VA if you're not diligent about submitting these names.
Mr. Massey, what you've told me is disturbing. At the VA, at Social Security, it was my understanding, and I am in no way suggesting you're wrong. So please do not hear me say that. Hear me say, I'm delighted that you're here to bring this issue up. It was my understanding that, quote, the Cornyn fix, or this part of it, was simply to ensure that the military branches, whether it be a court system, the military courts, or a federal district court, or a magistrate court, whatever might have rendered the decision, it could have been a military court, that they did not report those offenses where adjudication took place, where there was an understanding that they did not qualify further. And if it goes beyond that, I wish I were sitting at the table with you. I intend to make sure that I try and look at this. I am disappointed if that's in there. This is one of the parts of the puzzle that was spoken about by at least 3 members that were on to the right of me, and by others. This is what happens when you do the bill so quickly, that we're not able to ascertain the true intent of the bill. It's my intent tonight.
You can always vote against the rule.
I appreciate the gentleman. I did not bring that up with Mr. Massey, his desires and his way he would use his vote. I will just tell you, I played quarterback through school. I don't remember any interceptions. I have a short memory until the members' game this year, and I threw 2 of them. But I will tell you, I don't keep track of that. I would not in any way wish to use the rule in that endeavor, and the gentleman knows I feel strongly about that. But the legislation is an entirely different matter, and the gentleman knows that also. So without me trying to applaud the gentleman, I'm going to tell you I need to look into it. I'm disturbed, and I think what the gentleman's saying is worthy of the kind of homework that you do, the gentleman being a distinguished scholar as he is from his background by coming to Congress. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the motivations of everybody at this table. I learned something from at least one of you almost every day that I'm here, and so I value that. I'm concerned because I, like what I thought I heard General Perry say, is I believe we can do a better job of keeping guns out of the hands of bad people. And if NICS isn't doing it today, we need a Fix NICS bill. If NICS is, if false positives are a concern, then we should solve the false positives issue. It could be that the concern is the existence of a NICS system, period. Also a legitimate concern to have, but as I'm trying to unwind this, I can't tell, because the leadership didn't make a commitment to me on NICS. I can't tell how much of our discussion is because folks believe we're operating in bad faith, which is a serious problem in a small family like this one, and one that would need to be solved. Or if it's that by adding more names, we're going to increase the false positive count. Well, of course, if we're dealing with a flawed system and we have a small number of false positives, we add a bunch of names, we're going to get a bunch more positive positives, and we're going to get a bunch more false positives in the same ratio that we had them before. I wouldn't expect anything different. But if it's a problem that we need to fix, then we should fix NICS. Yeah. And as opposed to,
or as my amendment would do, ditch fix NICS.
My concern is, and folks often describe Pennsylvania to me, General Perry, as being Pittsburgh and Philadelphia surrounding Alabama, and that helps me to understand what it looks like. But as I read Pennsylvania law, it says no person shall possess a firearm if the person has been adjudicated as an incompetent or who has been involuntarily committed to a mental institution. We have to litigate ourselves. The federal statute says something very similar. Who has been adjudicated as incompetent? Does confessing that you don't want to manage your own finances count? We got together, we passed a law that said, no, Social Security Administration, you don't get to decide these issues. Those don't go into the fix NICS system. So I don't want to frighten folks by letting them believe that we have somehow changed our mind, and if this bill passes on the floor of the House tomorrow, suddenly the Social Security Administration is going to have the right to trump Second Amendment rights. It doesn't today, it didn't yesterday, and it won't tomorrow, no matter what we do with this bill. I raise that question because I don't think I have a constitutional right to go to a federal firearms dealer and purchase a gun. In fact, a federal firearms dealer doesn't have a constitutional right to be a federal firearms dealer, right? My first gun came from Santa Claus. I do think I have a constitutional right to have Santa Claus bring me a gun on December 25th. Lots of different ways to acquire guns. NICS system doesn't apply to all of them. I don't think it implicates constitutional rights in its application. It does implicate constitutional rights in who goes in the system and who doesn't. But what I would say to you is, if we have a problem with the text, we have one avenue of solutions ahead of us. If we have a problem with commitments, we have a completely different avenue of solutions ahead of us. And if we have both sets of problems, we have a different. And I see the gentleman from Ohio indicating we have both sets of problems, both language and process.
If I may address one of those, or a couple of those points.
Yield to the gentleman from
Thank
Kentucky.
you. If you go into the NICS database, not only are you prevented from purchasing a firearm from an FFL, you are now a felon if you possess a firearm. If you got it from Santa Claus, or you got it from your wife, or you found it, there in your closet and you forgot you had it, you are now a felon. You may not even purchase ammunition from your brother if you go into this database. So this isn't just about, when you go on this list, it's not just about not being able to go to an FFL. It's also about you can't possess that gun. And then just real quickly, I heard you say the word adjudicate, and I think that's an important word. I feel like it was abused by the prior administration in their Social Security ruling. They used the word adjudicate all in this Social Security ruling. But what they meant by adjudicate is that you would be adjudicated by the Social Security Administration. And I think adjudication of your constitutional rights needs to happen by a court, a judicial court, whether it's a military court, which would have been the case in Texas, right? Or a state court or Article III federal court. So just a couple clarifications in terminology.
Is the gentleman's understanding of federal code that it prohibits the transfer, that the crime lies in the transfer of a firearm to someone who's been adjudicated, or the possession?
It prevents the transfer, and it makes the possession illegal.
I would be interested in pursuing that. In pursuing that reading, my reading is very different. But we may divide the conference tomorrow on how this language reads. I think there's an open question about whether or not we can unite the conference, about whether or not we can do better. And I believe we can do better. But process is harder to solve than legislative language is. We can sit down tonight and solve legislative language. We probably won't be able to sit down tonight and solve a process. I thank the entire panel for bringing the amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Okay. The gentleman from Texas, gentleman from Georgia, gentleman from Alabama, gentleman from Washington, and I think the gentlelady had an opportunity to start. Is that correct, or do you have a question? Absolutely.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panel very much, and I think that you've seen from the conversation here that you've raised some very real and significant concerns, and I think these are concerns that have got to be addressed before we move forward on it. I've also heard from my constituents about concerns in terms of the Second Amendment and the violation of our Second Amendment rights that this could pose, in particular without the reciprocity language in this legislation. So I thank you for bringing this to us, and I think it's something we'll certainly address at conference. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for their testimony and the amendment.
Thank you for indulging us for so long. I know it's late. I know you've got a lot of other stuff to cover, and appreciate your consideration.
Thank you very much. If we could, we'll now move to our second panel, and that consists, obviously, Mr. Weber's already there, Mr. Mooney, Mr. Polis, Mr. Garrett, and I saw was gone outside. Mr. Gomet, are you here?
I filed amendments, some similar to what you had, but trying to fix maybe some.
He said,
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen.
Are you got a different amendment? I have 3 amendments. Okay. You want him to be with our defund Planned Parenthood amendment together?
We might as well. I mean,
called me, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah.
I absolutely did. I mean, that's what I've got on my list. So
Okay.
it's we can entertain different amendments at the same table.
Is this yours? Yeah. Okay. Do you want it?
But if we could, I don't know if you all have the same amendment.
have the
all
same
three?
amendment, yeah.
Okay.
We're on the same
Well, we'll obviously recognize all of you, but we'll deal with your amendment first, and then Mr. Polis, that's okay. We'll go to yours because I know you have several.
Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, he actually has an amendment.
Well, he's always welcome back. It's good to have the gentleman from Arizona. Okay, if we can, Mr. Mooney, I'll start with you or would you prefer to start with?
sharing an amendment, but he wanted to go
If
first.
you want to go first, whoever you want to do.
His
Mr.
name
Biggs,
is
you're
first.
recognized.
His name is first.
Mr. Chairman, I tell you what, I had this amendment. Mr. Mooney asked me if he could be on it, and I thought he was kind of nice, so we let him. But I appreciate y'all's time, your effort and energy, the work that every member of this committee's put in. I'm disappointed not to see Mr. Hastings in the room because he just said earlier that he thought every single amendment deserved an up or down vote on the floor, so by gosh, we're at 1. But ours deals with ensuring that monies allocated in this act are not allocated and ultimately received by the organization commonly referred to as Planned Parenthood. Mr. Chairman, I'm new here, but I'm not dumb, I don't think. I have a sneaking suspicion I know how this ends. I think we all have a sneaking suspicion we know how this ends. Having said that, the Supreme Court of the United States said you have a right to destroy unborn life. They didn't say we had a right to have to pay for it. As such, I think it's fiscally prudent to take this safeguard step to ensure that despite the fact that some might argue there's no direct allocation to Planned Parenthood in this budgeting process, oftentimes via Title X or however it is, they end up there. And anyone who says that they don't would be refuting the statements made publicly not only of Planned Parenthood, but also of the Washington Post, PolitiFact, et cetera, that show in the most recent year that we can quantify data, about $538 million ended up in the coffers of Planned Parenthood. These monies could easily go to federally qualified health care centers, which actually provide the women's health services en masse that Planned Parenthood seeks to identify themselves with. But I'll tell you, that's not how it generally ends up. And so when I ran, I promised I'd stand up for defenseless life. Tonight, I'm going to keep that promise. And while I think I know how this ends, I'll tell you and anyone else who is crazy enough to be watching that I'd rather be a failure than a liar because at least the failure tried. Last time we had data on how much money ended up at Planned Parenthood, again, it was about $538 million. That year, Planned Parenthood provided 328,348 abortions. That was about 4,500 higher than the year prior. I just spent 2 seconds of silence. If we spent 1 second of silence for each abortion provided by Planned Parenthood that year, we'd be here for 91 hours. That'd be 3.8 days. If we spent 1 second for each dollar that was allocated out of the federal taxpayers' hardworking wallets to Planned Parenthood that year, 1 second for each dollar, we'd be here for 5,787 days. About 16 years. Now, Planned Parenthood argues that they don't have a profit because they're a nonprofit. Instead, they say they have revenue that exceeds expenses. Most of us would call that a profit, but I suppose in the case of a nonprofit, I'll play their semantic games and say, okay, their revenue exceeded their expenses last time we checked by about $78 million. That's actually up 32% year over year. And yet we subsidize this right, as it's called. However, there are other rights more specifically articulated in the Bill of Rights, for example, the right to keep and bear arms, wherein I don't see $500 million government subsidizations for advocacy groups in their favor. I make that point to also point out that Planned Parenthood spent the last year that we have data for, 2016, about $40 million on campaigns. They also spent about $175 million on, quote, movement building and engaging communities. Now, I'm not that good at math. I was a history major. But I will tell you that if you add the campaign spending that Planned Parenthood engages in to the movement building and engaging community spending, and add in then the revenue over expenses that the rest of us call profit, you're up around $300 million. And so while we sit here and concur on each side of the aisle that there are expenditures that could be made differently, that we might be able to save taxpayers' dollars if the process were different, and again, I'm not casting aspersions on any individual in this room, I respect, I'd never criticize someone whose shoes I haven't walked in. But I walk in my own, and I would submit that these $300 million might go to supplant the monies that we've taken from the hardworking women and men of America. And if indeed the individuals on this committee would argue that no money goes to Planned Parenthood anyway, then this would simply be an exercise in promising individuals that we're putting our money where our mouth is. What we would refer to as a backstop, a redundancy, a safeguard. Now, I would dispute this, and despite the president's best efforts last year, the news stories would indicate that we were unable to ever defund Planned Parenthood. And so as it relates to whether or not there are specific allocations herein that would fund it, we know that whether it's via Title X, et cetera, these monies will end up there. So I certainly respect, and I want to thank Mr. Hastings again for his comment earlier that he believes that every single amendment deserves an up or down vote on the floor. I was very moved by his comments, and I think that's the way I saw it work too. But with that said, I do believe that this is beyond the purview of the federal government, that while there is a right to make this decision to destroy unborn life as recognized by the Supreme Court, there is no right to have the taxpayers fund it. And that while there are $300 million in monies between campaign spending, movement building, engaging communities, and revenues over expenses that Planned Parenthood doesn't seem to need to use to provide health care services each year, it would seem to be a redundancy to allocate tax funds to that end. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd yield to my colleague, Mr. Mooney.
Thank you.
He's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, my good friend from Virginia, for your comments. I just have 4 points to add to that. You spoke eloquently on the issue. At the beginning, the testimony, the Chairman of Appropriations, Chairman Frelinghuysen, mentioned having no riders on the appropriations bills. And I object to that. I think the House of Reps should put riders and restrict spending. I think that's part of our duty. I think one rider should be not to fund Planned Parenthood. I'm concerned about look, people have strong feelings on abortion one way or another. But most Americans don't believe taxpayer dollars should go to it. And we know money's fungible. You know, some people say, oh, it doesn't go to that part of Planned Parenthood, but money's fungible. When you give the money to Planned Parenthood, if it saves from one area, it can go to the other, so the abortion part. Even many pro-choice people on abortion believe that taxpayer dollars should not go to it. So I think most Americans would like to see money restricted in this manner. But we don't do that. And here we have a pro-life House of Representatives, a pro-life Senate, bipartisan pro-life majority, as I might add. Even on the Senate floor, if there was a vote to fund or not fund Planned Parenthood, the pro-life side would win. My senator in West Virginia, Joe Manchin, has voted not to fund Planned Parenthood, for example, and he's a Democrat. Donnelly from Indiana. There are more pro-life votes in the Senate than there are pro-abortion votes. Same in the House. And we have a pro-life president. There's no reason we don't defund Planned Parenthood through legislation. It was mentioned earlier that the president could do it on his own. But you know what? We're the House of Reps. The power of the purse, the power to spend or not to spend rests with us. I'm concerned Congress has continued to delegate too many decisions to the executive branch of all kinds. And this is a very important one because this is human life, and this is how the tax dollars of the American people are spent. And they expect us, the House of Reps, which is specifically in the Constitution in our chamber, to use that judiciously. So it should not be going to organizations that do abortion. The only reason we can do it, in my fourth and last point, Congressman from Washington State, my friend Dan Newhouse, mentioned the four corners system of doing this bill. And if one person objects, it can't get in there. And the only reason is, I guess 60 people or the 41 people will filibuster and shut down the entire government if they can't get their Planned Parenthood abortion funding. Well, make them do that. That is an extreme thing to do, shut down government to force the funding of Planned Parenthood and the killing of unborn children. So I feel strongly we should put this in the House bill. We're the House of Reps. We should put this in there and fight this fight because the people that voted us in office expect us to do it. I yield back my time to the gentleman. I think Mr. Weber was on this issue.
Mr. Biggs, your testimony on the same amendment?
Well, actually, I've got two amendments of my own.
Why don't we deal with this one first, and we'll certainly then let you go to your next. But
Mr. Chairman,
so your testimony does not relate to this. You have different amendments?
I have different amendments.
Oh, that's fine.
if I might, I was going to speak in favor of all four of these amendments, but at the end.
Okay, well, I guess you're our designated cleanup
I'm
hitter,
your designated cleanup
We
hitter.
will then go to Mr. Biggs' amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for indulging my naivete or maybe inexperience in yielding back too soon last time. That won't happen again, I can tell you that. My first amendment, which I think is number 5, it's number 5 in the list, and basically it says that we're going to defund or no longer make funds available to the special counsel appointed last May 17th, or on or about last May 17th. And I just want to remind everyone that the purpose of that special counsel was to, ostensibly anyway, was to investigate any Russian collusion between the then candidate Donald Trump or any of his organization and to influence the 2016 presidential election. Now, I would have anticipated that as things moved along, if the special counsel wanted to expand the scope of his investigation, that he would have turned his role on any collusion with the Russians to influence that election. But that doesn't seem to be what he has done. He has exceeded his scope. In fact, former Director Comey, Mr. Clapper, and even the House Intelligence Committee has said that there is no collusion. And I've always thought collusion was an odd term as well. It's not a criminal offense to collude. It would be instead criminal to form a conspiracy. That would be criminal. That would be interesting. So there's been no accountability, and I think that it's time to pull the plug on this. And so that's why I've introduced this amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Texas is. I think you have a second.
I have a second.
Oh, excuse me. Thanks.
That's all right.
I arrived too late.
It's all right. It's good to see you back in the chair, Mr. Chairman. The second amendment is deals with the very idea that there are federal grants that are given to local jurisdictions to assist them in funding their assistance in enforcement of immigration laws or naturalization laws. That's important. And so we as a federal government said we're going to fund that because you have expenses if you're going to help us enforce those laws. When you choose not to help us enforce those immigration laws, then my question is, why do we continue to provide funding, which in many jurisdictions we do? We continue to provide grant money. We need to make them ineligible. That's what my amendment does. And I'm more than happy to expand on that, but you're here late. I think you understand the gist of what I'm saying. I'm passionate about both these issues, and I appreciate the time of this committee. I appreciate what the gentleman from Florida said. I would like to see these go to the floor. I would like to see them get a vote, up or down. You know, I've been a state legislator, and now I've done this. look, I ran bills in Arizona where that lost, we only have 60 members of the House, and I think I lost bills 56-4 before. So I am not afraid to lose a bill, but I do think it's just to let members of this body put bills, or excuse me, amendments on the floor, let them have a chance, let the body decide the value of that. And I will say this, the one thing I disagreed with you, it's not a waste of time because we are representing and advocating our position for our constituents. With that, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Biggs, thank you very much. As a matter of fact, I share your belief. It is important, and that's why you're allowed not only to come up here, but to make your full argument that I strongly believe in and appreciate you taking time to do that. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So members of this committee, you've heard 4 amendments tonight that I want to speak on, and I will take them in the order of Mr. Garrett and Mr. Moody's defunding no tax dollars for abortions. In fact, our friend from Colorado here in his remarks earlier said that he was concerned about the deficit spending. Well, here's a way to save that $300+ million, no tax dollars to fund abortions. We did that in Texas, by the way, when I was in the Texas legislature. It can be done. And secondly, I want to talk, so members of the committee, you have a chance tonight to vote for that very fundamental proposition to take care of this budget by at least exempting that amount of money from taxpayers' dollars so it doesn't go to fund abortions. Mr. Biggs had a couple of amendments. Immigration reform. He has a common sense amendment to make sure that our federal dollars are planted by agencies along cities and counties and states doing their job, not working against us and costing us more money, but working with us. No city, county, or state gets to thumb their nose at federal law as authorized by the Constitution. And the federal law doesn't get to, the federal government doesn't get to thumb its nose at a duly authorized state law by the Constitution. So this is a great concept for us. You should be in favor of this amendment because it's going to encourage the start of immigration reform and helping to share the costs and not having some city or county or state thumbing their nose at us, causing us legal dollars, causing us manpower hours, and causing problems in the immigration reform. You should be for that. As far as Mr. Biggs' amendment on defunding the investigation that Robert Mueller is doing, there's been no evidence in 14 months of collusion with this administration. In fact, if anything, it's been on the other side of the aisle. So I hope that you will consider that. Again, that's a cost-saving factor. And then I will go on to Mr. Massey's Second Amendment fix NICS without reciprocity. You absolutely know that the reciprocity bill passed the House, that we were told that fixed NICS would not come back. You want to talk about process, the gentleman talked about earlier from Georgia. You want to talk about process, not being able to fix the process, you can address the law. I agree with that, you can address the law. But there's part of the process we can fix too tonight. These amendments could be made in order. That word could be kept. And the rest of this House could feel like, as the gentleman from Florida said, these amendments could be heard on the floor of the House. Regular order could be observed. And these are all, I would say, these 4 amendments that have been presented here tonight. You talk to your constituents. You look at what we stand for. All 4 of these amendments would save us money, get us back to regular order, make sure that we're doing the people's work. And, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for indulgence. I hope you'll vote for this. You know that Americans are watching. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I just want to acknowledge it's now 15 past midnight, and it's officially your birthday. So we want to wish you a happy birthday. And our gift to you is Mr. Poles is going to testify on 4 amendments. Happy birthday.
Made it. I said, I hope you make it too, Dan, and he said he would. I wanted to, before we recognize the gentleman, distinguished gentleman from Colorado, to provide some bit of feedback subject to me getting a second opinion, but the opinion that has been given to me is that the fixed NICS provisions would change some dollar amounts, would authorize $125,000 instead of $100,000, and then they specifically delineated the changes, none of which would change any authorization or reauthorization, no changes for any agencies to change current restrictions or benefits of law, which would mean to me, notwithstanding we've had testimony tonight, that I'm going to need to check on the fixed NICS title that is in here. There is no belief based upon this opinion that I got that there would be any change to Social Security or the VA. Now, I've got the language here. I'll share it with you. I appreciate what you've said. I've tried to listen. We've tried to, as best we can, verify this. It would be my hope that tomorrow on the floor, I would be able to reassert what I have been told is in the bill and the proper language. So I just want us, there are people watching, Mr. Weber, a lot of people watching from the 14th District of Texas, a lot of people watching from the 32nd Congressional District of Texas, those two districts which are very important to me and to you. And all I'm suggesting to you is there are points of contention, points of resolve, points of unresolved issues. I'm attempting to give you back an answer now based upon a review that has been done by outside people, meaning the people who actually wrote the bill, who would be able to ascertain that, who studied it more than we. So with that said, I did not want you to be able to sleep tonight. Does the gentleman seek time? Okay, I really do mean that.
No, and I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. It's very, very important, and I appreciate the committee's diligence. I mean, these are important issues.
Yes, sir, they are.
And so I appreciate that explanation, and we look forward to that. You said you'd be able to affirm it on the floor tomorrow. So
And I will reaffirm it. I'm going to ask the gentleman, either the clerk, Ms. Booth, or the gentleman, Mr. Hubbard, to please provide the written information which I have been provided along with the information that was provided to me and the detail.
Right.
So this is the best I have available. Would need to reassert that and state it into the record on the floor tomorrow.
Well, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, let's see here if we can real fast. Does anybody have a question for our two distinguished visitors from Arizona or Texas, the gentleman from Oklahoma?
It's not a question because I want to talk about the Planned Parenthood because I'm very sympathetic. The House bill as was written actually did not have Title X money and it was taken out. And we had the prohibition in. And I just want the gentleman to know what the state of play is at this moment. While that's what we passed, the Senate passed a version through committee, not across the floor, to be fair. They didn't pass a single appropriations bill across the floor this year. But their committee version actually would have grandfathered in any group that had gotten a grant in the past. So that was the real point. That language is all gone now. So that was a huge point of contention to knock that out. Had the Senate position prevailed, these groups would have continued to receive money. To be fair to the administration, and I know our colleague from Arizona would not, he might not have this information. The Trump administration has terminated all Title II teen pregnancy grants. They're just, to Planned Parenthood. That's just done. They have not approved a single grant for Planned Parenthood since the president has been in office. And indeed, they're moving to try and reduce the ones that are multiple years long. Not every grant is for a single year. So their record here is pretty good, and I think there's some assurance. I actually sympathize with the idea that my colleagues advanced to put this in the bill, just to have the backstop. I can tell you we don't have the votes to do that. While we may have a pro-life Senate, we don't have a we don't have 60 votes. And I would remind some of my friends, not every Republican is pro-life, certainly not in the United States Senate. There are some that have a different point of view on that. So I share that give you my commitment because I do deal with these in my particular subcommittee on appropriations. So if I could wave a wand and get it done, I promise you I'd do it. Protecting the administration's ability not to make grants like this was a big step in the right direction. Of course, the real step is you got an administration that'll do it. So we're not giving up on the fight over the course of the administration, and we don't disagree with what you're trying to do, and I appreciate you coming up, quite frankly, and raising the points, because I think that discussion needs to be had. To me, I know how my friends on the other side might feel. The NRA has perfectly wonderful courses in gun safety. I doubt they would want federal dollars. We said, well, we're not going to do anything over here, promotion of this, but just for gun safety, surely you would want everybody to do it. I wouldn't want federal dollars going to them for that purpose either. So this distinction, which my friend made, and he's right, I think money is fungible. I think if you want to do this, do it with your own dollars. And we have plenty of legitimate places community health centers where these dollars could be expended for women's health or family planning in a way that was not connected with abortion whatsoever. So I commend my friend's effort, but it is important to know, while I think money's fungible, these dollars don't go directly for abortion. The Trump administration has not granted any dollars to Planned Parenthood in either the teen pregnancy category, and they have not in terms of Title X either. So I just add that, and I certainly would give my friend an opportunity to respond.
Well, so, Mr. Chairman, if that's the case, then passing this amendment wouldn't hurt anything.
Well, it would cost you votes. That's a calculation here, and with all due respect, not everybody that favors the amendment is going to vote for the bill anyway.
Well, sir,
some people that are going to vote for the bill don't favor the amendment.
I would point out that 100% of the Democrats who've been elected in the last 2 weeks are pro-life. So not all Democrats. That's an
encouraging trend,
right? That was the point. But not all Democrats are pro-terminating life. But the point I would make, though, is this: that there is a right recognized by the courts, disagree though some of us may, to an abortion, not to fund that abortion. We also have a right to keep and bear arms, but nobody's trying to fund those gun safety courses. Every news source that I can find has indicated that there's been a lot of action towards denying funding, but that funding has not stopped. And so ultimately there's a shell game here, and I want to be...
Well,
I guess
please,
time will tell.
Ahead.
Yes, sir. And again, with total respect, genuinely. But, if these things are core values for us, if we believe in these things, and we know that this is going to be a tough fight, and we understand that there's a this for that, and that maybe you lose some votes. But if it's a core value, why not go to the wall on it?
Well, I would point out we did on the floor of the House. We did exactly, and we did it in committee. Quite frankly, you never had to vote to strip money out of plan or the Title X funding because there wasn't any in the House bill. Period, not a dime. So
yes, sir.
We live in a legislative process. We do have and frankly, the president pointed away. You elect enough people, you can do it. You got a president of the United States, and he's not funding. He has got control of this. But we ought to continue to work. And my friend's right. I don't disagree with what you're trying to do. I just disagree that there's money in here for Planned Parenthood. There's not. There's Title X and Title II funding. We have a president that's not approved any grants in this area. And just again, we don't disagree on where you're trying to go. I'm just saying I'm not sure we can get there all in one step. The other thing I'd point out, well, you use the figure of over $500 million. Actually, in this bill, that would not apply. Over 90% of that money, or roughly 90% of that money, is Medicaid money, which this bill does not deal with. And that's another area where I think we ought to be working to do exactly what you're trying to do.
Well, is it appropriate for me to ask you one question, sir?
Yes, sir.
Do you have confidence that none of the money in this budget will end up in the hands of
I have
Planned
confidence the President of the United States will keep the campaign commitments because he kept them so far.
No, sir. But
I don't get to make it. Look, I agree with what you're trying to do, All I'm telling you is we don't have the votes to do it. We were able to stop the effort to grandfather in that money to make sure that didn't happen. The president's done everything. I think you have to keep working these things through. And again, I don't disagree with what my friend's trying to accomplish at all.
I want to just close. And
Certainly.
again, I in no way, shape, or form wish to be disrespectful. Some things in life, you know, and I think we're in the same spot here in
We
our
are.
hearts. But in my experience legislatively, which is far, far, far tiny compared to yours, sometimes the way you get the votes to do these things is by making people go on the record, is by putting people on the record explicitly as to this sort of amendment and letting them go be held accountable to the 730 plus or minus 1,000 people in their districts. And by gosh, I think this is an issue where, you know what, and if I lose an election over this, then by God, I'll go before my Creator with a clear conscience. But sometimes we get these votes by making people go on the record. And again, with no disrespect to anybody up here. And no disrespect to anybody that disagrees with me. But that's how we get these votes, make people go on the record.
I don't have any problem with that. I have a 100% pro-life record, so
Yes, sir.
I'm very happy to go on the record anytime, any occasion we can.
Well, I don't
I'm
want to be
saying
disrespectful, so I'll conclude.
you have
I
not
appreciate your
been-
indulgence.
You
I
have not
genuinely
been
do.
disrespectful in the least. And frankly, I appreciate you being here and advancing the argument, because you're arguing for something I believe in.
Yes, sir.
I just was pointing out the progress that has been made, the things that we kept from happening that could have happened had the Senate position prevailed, and what the president has done to keep his campaign commitments. No way takes away from what you're trying to do. Quite frankly, I think step by step you're moving in the right direction, and the argument and discussion is useful. But I don't want to. I would tell you we don't appropriate money to Planned Parenthood. But my friend makes a fair point that when you give the authority to grant, then those people can do it. We had an administration that did exactly that. Fortunately, we have one right now that does not, but that won't last forever. You know, presidents have terms. So again, we don't disagree on this. I just wanted to put some facts on the table to add to my friend's argument. So with that, yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I just want to say that Chairman Cole has dealt with this issue for a long, long time. I have never heard a member be more clear about not only the policy, but about their intent. And I don't think anybody in this organization needs to stand up for Tom Cole. We're not in that circumstance. There's no challenge. I don't take it that way. What I want to say to you is, Mr. Cole is consistent and very clear. I'll be pleased to talk with you offline, but we're delighted that you're here. In the development of you as a new member of this conference, this is critical. Mr. Biggs referred to his first time up here. We want you to remember this time. We want you to remember the next time. You will be able to come speak your mind up at this committee and articulate thoughtfully your ideas, and expect that we provide back some bit of help and reason back. I think you presented yourself very well today.
And Mr. Chairman, if I might, they don't have to wait till your next birthday either.
Right. May I say something by way of editorial comment for 10 seconds, because you opened the door? One of the things that frustrates me the most in this, and I really was moved by your comments, that frustrates me the most is people who attack the person and not the idea. That we can disagree on ideas without disagreeing on people, the ad hominem attacks. And so the tone, I didn't want to come across, I hope I didn't. We
don't take it that way at all.
Well, we ought to stop. We did to, what people on our side of the aisle did to the last president, what people on the other side of the aisle are doing to this president on an ad hominem level is un-American. We need to get away from that. We need to attack ideas and not people. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
For your indulgence.
And thank you very much. But also the gentleman, Mr. Weber, and I know each other very well. And he even saves a place at lunch for me most of the Thursdays. But I gave him back what I thought was an honest opinion. And if I'm wrong, then I will tell him and anybody else on the floor tomorrow I'm wrong, but that's the best we gather tonight. And I appreciate and respect each of you. Does anyone have any further questions for these three gentlemen? Mr. Chairman? Yes, sir. Gentleman of Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a moment. I do think words matter. My friend from Texas came to the table and said, I want to make sure no tax dollars go to fund abortions. And I agree with him. Mr. Cole agrees with him. Mr. Garrett agrees. And in fact, that's the law of the land as we sit here today. And I wonder for those folks on both sides of the aisle who unite for the cause of life, how much time and energy we waste and how much further we end up from our goal because we don't always get the words right. I've fielded a half a dozen text messages in the last 10 minutes wanting to know why it is there's $500 million for Planned Parenthood in the bill that's before the Rules Committee tonight. Well, it's just not true, and it's never has been true. It never will be true. And as we sit here right now, you can read the pages to your heart's content. It will continue not to be true, and we've got to grapple with that. How do we advance the cause if we've got all of our army focused on the wrong objective? Because it's just not true. I would say to my friend from North Carolina, sometimes you do have to put the bill on the floor and get the votes. And we did that last fall for the first time in my 7 years here. I've been here a little longer than you. I was as pleased as I could be that we finally mustered up the commitment to do what we said we would do and put exactly that language on the floor and pass it across the House floor. My question for my conservative friends is, maybe I can get to 60 votes on that language as it doesn't change the law of the land. Folks could reincorporate and have their money be just as fungible any way they wanted to do. But what would I have to pay for it? And what I would ask my friend, because he is such a leader in the pro-life community, is what would we trade away to Chuck Schumer to get to those 60 votes? This is the conference report, right? We passed the bill. This is the deal at the end. We don't, to Mr. Biggs' point, in the state legislature, you were alone on many of your amendments, but I doubt you ever had an amendment to a conference report because we just don't do amendments to conference reports. That's after the deal's been cut. You can't amend the deal after it's been done. What would we have to trade away? And there may be a price that we as a pro-life community would be willing to trade away to get exactly the language that is offered as an amendment here tonight, but it wouldn't be free. It would come at a heavy price, and we just have to be willing to pay that price to achieve the nominal goal of saying Planned Parenthood shall not receive money, rather than the actual playing field as it exists today, which is Planned Parenthood is not going to receive any of that money. And it's certainly a debate worth having, but it's not a freebie. And I don't want any of our pro-life friends to be mistaken in how they see this bill that's before us tonight. Mr. Biggs, to your point, I think if this were the first time around in the appropriations bill, I think we would make those amendments in order. I think we'd absolutely get up or down votes on those issues because they're important issues and they're germane and they ought to be had at the conference report level. Never in 7 years have we made an amendment in order to a conference report. I would not expect us to do that tonight either. I can't negotiate in good faith with someone and then come back and say, but I'm gonna change the deal on the floor tomorrow. And that will always be our conference report challenge. But we've got a brand new round of appropriations bills coming up this year, and I hope Mr. Chairman will be able to have Mr. Biggs back and make those amendments in order during a House-driven appropriations process.
You won't need to make them in order; they'll be in the bill.
They will be in the base text of the bill. You heard it here first, Mr. Chairman.
They were this year.
Soon the other members seek time with our distinguished guests. I want to thank all three of you for being here. Please do know that you have done your duty tonight, and I hope you'll be able to sleep well. We appreciate your confidence to come up and speak your mind. Thank you very much.
I apologize. I confused you two, and I apologize.
Mr. Polis, we're delighted that you're here. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did we save the best for last, Mr. Chairman?
You know, it's my birthday, so that's why we're here to celebrate.
Well, I would love a gift of you making my amendments in order today, Mr. Chairman. I want to rescue our nation from the fiscal disaster that this bill is. And my first amendment, Mr. Chairman, would simply cut defense spending by 1%. My amendment would go a small way towards protecting the fiscal security of our nation. Because when we spend more than we can afford to, more than we have, we actually make our nation less secure by mortgaging our future to countries like China and Saudi Arabia. so we can restore some degree of fiscal integrity and defend our country by passing my 1% cut, which gives broad authority to the Secretary of Defense to reduce the overall amount by 1%. The additional spending would still be far above the budget caps that we agreed to, that you voted for and I voted for a couple of years ago. It would still be a substantial increase and still spend far more than I would like to on defense, about as much as the rest of the world combined on our military. But my amendment would save some money and help reduce the budget deficit. A 1% cut would leave us well above the original defense caps, and I hope that we can allow this simple common sense measure that would save taxpayers tens of billions of dollars to go to the floor of the House. So if we're going to move forward with this massive Republican spending bill, let's at least restore some degree of fiscal responsibility. I'm willing to compromise. It's less than cuts that I have proposed. It's simply a 1% cut that leaves intact defense spending above the previous budget cap levels, which you and I have both supported. So I hope that that amendment is made in order. If I can proceed to my second amendment, Mr. Chairman, my second amendment relates to a funding restriction to prevent Department of Justice from going after legal cannabis in states like mine, Colorado, where it's legal. 95% of the country lives in an area that has some kind of legal marijuana. And study after study shows that having a well-regulated marijuana market can decrease underage use, bankrupt drug cartels and criminals, reduce violent crime, increase tax revenues. And Colorado is one of those test cases, and I'm proud to say, Mr. Chairman, it's been an overwhelming success. Underage use of marijuana is down. Instead of sending money to drug cartels, it's going to employment and businesses. We simply need to include this amendment, which is based on the language of the McClintock-Polis bill. My good friend and yours, Mr. McClintock of California, a Republican. This is a bipartisan amendment. So it's really not a partisan issue at all. In fact, about 70 members, including 20 Republicans, signed a letter requesting that this amendment be included in this continuing resolution or omnibus. So I'm confident that we can pass this, Mr. Chairman, if you simply allow it out of this committee to the floor. An overwhelming majority of Congress supports what an overwhelming majority of the American people support. And that is, Mr. Chairman, to let states decide. Let states decide how best to regulate marijuana. You don't have to support marijuana legalization and support the McClintock-Polis amendment. You certainly don't have to support legalization to allow this to go to the floor for an up or down vote. And I think there's far-reaching support that on issues like marijuana policy, we should allow the states to decide and not put our legal businesses and residents and constituents at risk of a Department of Justice enforcement action based on what side of the bed our Attorney General wakes up on a given day. The list of reasons that we should support this amendment go on and on, but let me just be very simple, Mr. Chairman. We should give money to classrooms, not cartels. We should create jobs, not addicts, and we should boost our economy, not our prison population. And for those reasons, I ask that Polis Amendment number 7 be made in order. Mr. Chairman, I also offer Polis Amendment number 9, which is the Bipartisan DREAM Act, which I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of, introduced by Representative Roy Ball Allard. This is a bipartisan, bicameral piece of legislation. It would allow dreamers, deferred action beneficiaries, young people who grew up in this country and know no other country, to receive conditional permanent residency and someday earn their citizenship. After President Trump announced he was ending the DACA program, Democrats and Republicans came together in support of a permanent solution, the DREAM Act. Now, yes, many of these young people are able to continue to work legally today, but that right to work legally and be here legally rests on a precedent that could go away any minute. It's simply a court case that's on appeal. It hangs by a thread. We shouldn't allow the lives of millions of aspiring Americans to hang by the thread of a court decision. We owe it to them to get this right in law, Mr. Chairman. And I know we have a bipartisan majority that would pass this amendment. Today, my amendment offers a permanent solution for the dreamers. This bill has support from Democrats and Republicans. Dreamers and DACA recipients could finally rest easy knowing that they're no longer in imminent danger of deportation to countries they don't even know and don't even remember having been to. Despite the court precedent, there's hundreds of DACA recipients and dreamers who lose their legal status every day, Mr. Chairman, because of the lapse in time between their applications and the renewal. So I want to be clear, this has already affected the loss of legal status to work, thousands, if not tens of thousands, of aspiring Americans, and it will affect more. It could affect all of them if the preservation of the DREAM Act is overturned. But at the very least, Mr. Chairman, it will affect thousands more who will suffer a lapse in their ability to work. People who simply are working legally here one day, have lived here their whole lives, and the next day can't even go into work and support their American families, I might add, often their American children, American spouse. And that's why Americans of all stripes, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, majorities of all those groups, believe that we should pass a bill to protect the dreamers. And that's why I'm simply asking this committee to allow us to do that. I ask that the DREAM Act be included as just an up or down vote on the omnibus so we can include it in this bill. President Trump has said he would be open to including action to address the dreamers in this bill, and I'm confident that he would sign this bill if this were attached. We can guarantee over 1 million aspiring Americans the chance to live and work in the only country they know where their contributions are valued and accepted. I ask the committee make in order my Polis Amendment number 9, the DREAM Act, and I'm happy to yield for questions.
Mr. McGovern, Mr. Polis, thank you very much. The provisions, as I understand it in the law, in this document would allow favorability to states that have passed medical marijuana for them to avoid any interference from federal agencies.
Mr. Chairman, so states like Colorado and many others have a licensing system for medical marijuana and also a licensing system for recreational commercial marijuana.
That's correct.
We also have the constitutional right in our state for residents of our state to have up to 6 plants that they grow in their home for their own use. That's a constitutional right in our state. The voters put that in the Constitution. So those are not protected by what is known as the Rohrabacher-Blumenauer language. So it provides a small degree of protection for some of the medical dispensaries in our state.
That's what I'm suggesting.
But most of our dispensaries offer the commercially regulated marijuana, and it offers no protection for those who are exercising their constitutional rights in our state. And again, it is a constitutional right in our state constitution to grow up to 6 plants of marijuana for their own use. So the language is insufficient, Mr. Chairman, and the McClintock-Polis language would be sufficient. Wouldn't surprise me if the
Department of Justice figured out if that's what it was for, to stay in the state.
Sorry?
They might figure out that if it's to stay in the state, perhaps they would not prosecute it. But if it's not to stay in the state, they would be in violation of federal law.
And that was contained in the Cole Memorandum of the previous administration, which unfortunately Attorney General Sessions threw out. Yes, and that was very clear that interstate commerce into a state where it's illegal is an appropriate way to use federal resources. I think you and I agree. I don't have a problem with that, Mr. Chairman.
So
and this amendment would not prohibit that either.
I'm just suggesting that the medical marijuana piece would be included, I believe, in the law, and would be at least some victory.
Yes, it's the same language that's been in the last several omnibus bills, and it addresses a small subset of the concerns in our state. But most of the legal regulated marijuana business would not be protected by that language that's in the omnibus in my state.
Yes, Mr. Cole? No questions. Mr. McGovern?
Well, it's 1:15 in the
Yes, sir, it is.
in the morning, and I don't think anything I would say would be fully appreciated.
Yes, sir.
So I will yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Judge Hastings? Thank you very much. Any other member of the committee? Thank you very much. Ms. Polis, thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony. If you'll please leave anything brought in writing for the stenographer to please make sure that she completes the record accordingly. Is there any other member that seeks time before the committee? Excuse me. Yes, that's absolutely correct, and he's going to stay there and not move down front. So the gentleman from the state of Washington is recognized, Mr. Newhouse, for the purpose of an amendment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Truly saving the best for last, Mr. Polis.
That's the way I'm thinking about it.
Exactly. So I am Proud to offer amendment number 16, if you want to look in your records.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, my constituents and I, we need your help. We need the help of everybody on this dais, and we need the help of my colleagues in the whole body of the House, and we actually need the help of my 2 state senators as well. I'll just be brief, but let me just tell you exactly what this amendment is about. In less than 2 weeks, 8 of our lower Snake River and Columbia River dams in the federal Columbia River power system will be forced to spill water due to a single judge's decision to disregard the science and the collaboration that was conducted between the scientists and the engineers at our federal agencies, the 4 states in the Northwest, the sovereign Northwest Indian tribes, local and regional stakeholders and experts, all who have worked together in an unprecedented fashion to put together and develop the 2014 biological opinion that is used to manage and operate the Columbia River system. The federal action agencies have recently estimated that the cost of this forced spill by this single judge will be an additional $40 million this year alone on the backs of ratepayers in the Northwest. Now, over the past many months, I've been working very hard with many of my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, to develop legislation, H.R. 3144, that will uphold the 2014 biological opinion. But we've also developed some more targeted language that, for this appropriations bill that we have in front of us today, that will simply put a pause on the forced spill while agencies can continue to conduct a new biological opinion and the updated NEPA analysis. And I should add that all of the action agencies support this language, and we have worked with them over the last few months through technical assistance to come up with this language. Mr. Chairman, as you can tell, I take this amendment very seriously. I believe that a $40 million bill that will be on the backs of my constituents and others in the Northwest is worth taking a stand against. I'd hope this could have been a part of the underlying language. It's a simple, no funds provision. You note, I'm not asking for any money whatsoever. I'm only asking that the U.S. Congress step up and prevent this reckless decision from taking place, from harming my constituents and many others' constituents in the Northwest, and harming our rural, our agricultural-based economy, which relies so heavily on the Pacific Northwest waterways. This will allow the work to continue, to perfect the operation of the Columbia River system, but will prevent our people from being subjected to an unfair cost. And I would humbly offer this amendment and ask your support.
Thank you very much. The gentleman had mentioned that he'd been working this. Have you had any interaction with any of your United States senators?
Absolutely, we have. We still do not have the support, at least of one of my senators, for the underlying bill that we've been working on.
Yes.
And are continuing to work to try to get the support of the language we'd like to include in the appropriations bill, but still are lacking that.
So you think one senator supports it and one does not?
One is on record opposing, the other is not. And so whether or not that indicates support, I can't say.
Okay, one last question, and then we'll move on. I know we're trying to keep moving. We appreciate and respect the gentleman for bringing this. Did the federal government agencies take a position in the court?
In the court proceedings itself?
Court proceedings, that what I would call the trial phase.
I'm advised that they are currently opposing and did take a position, yes.
So they would
in the court.
They would support your position, they oppose?
In fact, they have worked with us to develop the language that we are offering here today.
And as part of that follow-up, then, would there be an avenue for this to be taken up by the Court of Appeals? I'm not suggesting you would have any relief out of the Ninth Circuit, I believe, but
I believe that's exactly right, that there would be that avenue, but this is an opportunity for us as a Congress to take positive action. Court decisions are not always a sure thing, either one way or the other.
They're not.
And so this would be something that we could make a decision and prevent something that I think is unfair.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Oklahoma. Gentleman from Georgia. Is there any member of the committee on the Democratic side that would wish to engage the gentleman? Thank you very much. I want to thank the gentleman for offering his amendment for the practice of consideration, including the gentileness that the gentleman offered as a professional, and also from a policy perspective of representing his district. I want to thank the gentleman very much. Is there any other member that would, gentleman yields back his time, and we yield back questions. Is there any other member of the body that would seek to give testimony on Senate Amendment, what's called the Target Act, to H.R. 1625? Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion of this hearing this evening, and Chairman will be in receipt of a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant a rule providing for the consideration of the Senate amendment to H.R. 1625, the Target Act. The rule makes an order of motion offered by the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or a designee that the House concur in the Senate amendment with an amendment consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 115-66. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion. The rule provides that the Senate amendment and the motion shall be considered as read. The rule provides 1 hour of debate on the motion equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. Section 2 of the rule provides that any legislative day during the period from March 23, 2018 through April 9, 2018, the Journal of House Proceedings of the previous day shall be considered as approved. The chair may at any time declare the House adjourned to meet at a date and time to be announced by the chair in declaring the adjournment. Section 3 of the rule provides that the Speaker may appoint members to perform the duties of the chair for the duration of the period addressed by Section 2. Section 4 of the rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 2 of the rule shall not constitute a calendar day for the purposes of Section 7 of the War Powers Resolution. Section 5 of the rule provides that each day during the period addressed by Section 2 of the rule shall not constitute a legislative day for purposes of Clause 7 of Rule 13. Finally, Section 6 of the rule provides that the chair of the Committee on Appropriations may insert in the congressional record not later than March 23, 2018, such material as he may deem explanatory of the Senate amendment and the motion specified in Section 1 of the rule.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma to present the motion. Is there an amendment or discussion to that? Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move to make an order in block my amendments number 7, 8, and 9 to provide the necessary waivers. Mr. Chairman, this would simply allow an up or down vote on the McClintock-Polis amendment to protect states like mine that have regulate marijuana like alcohol and allow states where it remains illegal to stay that way. It just allows states to make the decision. I also include an amendment that would reduce defense spending by 1%, still leaving it far above the budget cap that you and I supported, but recognize some degree of savings for taxpayers. And finally, Mr. Chairman, it would include the DREAM Act, allow for an up or down vote, which I believe would pass, bipartisan bill to allow aspiring Americans to work legally and someday earn their citizenship, removing the potential for deportation that exists with their legal status hanging by a thread through the court decision. So I hope the committee will agree to make an order those 3 amendments, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman has offered an en bloc amendment. Further discussion? Seeing none, the vote now be on the Polis amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Noes have it, noes have it.
Roll call.
Gentleman asks for roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole. No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall. No. Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess. No. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Collins. No. Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, no. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Buck. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis?
Aye.
Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk will report the total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment's not agreed to, further amendment or discussion. Seeing none, the vote will now be on the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, the ayes have it.
Chairman, can we have a roll call on that?
Gentlemen, ask for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis?
No.
Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, I will be handling this for Republicans.
And I will be handling for the Democrats.
Mr. McGovern will be handling for Democrats. I would like to make note of a distinguished guest that we have this evening. The distinguished Mr. Hugh Halprin, former staff director of the committee, has chosen to come and join us at this early hour. Hugh, we used to meet later than this when you were here. We've gotten a little bit more efficient under Mr. Cody. But we do appreciate you taking time from your palatial suite down with the speaker to come join us, and we're delighted that you're here. And thank you for taking time to be with us. Is there any further questions from the committee?
Mr. Chairman,
we
do you have
not
any?
expect additional meetings this week.
Mr. Chairman, when is this going to the floor? Is it tonight or tomorrow morning?
I would anticipate that I'm going to walk down here in a matter of minutes to file the rule. I would. I file tomorrow? Well, you didn't hear me yet. I would anticipate that I will leave here within a few minutes, go file the rule, and then I would anticipate that we come in at 9:00 a.m. tomorrow, and you would expect to see Mr. McGovern and I prepared and ready to go at about that hour.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. This completes our work for the day, and I want to thank our awesome stenographer and the office for their presentation and helping us get through this long meeting today. Thank you very much. This concludes Rules Committee meeting for this week.